Okay, here we go.
Morena Fano, welcome back to day 2 of the Congress for this year. I hope you enjoyed yesterday. There was certainly some really interesting speakers and presentations. And if you haven't seen or you want to see any of the presentations again, they are available online. Susan has uploaded them, so you'll be able to access them from the EDNZ website. The second day, the theme for today is how ready were we and what were some of our initial responses? And there's a great program of speakers that we've got lined up today. You're going to hear both from practitioners, from people that have been sort of providing advice and commentary at the national level, and then towards the end of the day, we also get to also hear from some of the politicians around their views on regional development going forward. So it should be a really good day again. A couple of quick housekeeping issues, just sort of a bit like yesterday. I can encourage you, if you wish to turn your mics and your cameras off, so we can focus on the presenters, and also helps with the bandwidth and connectivity. If you wish to ask a question during the course of the presentations, try and use the chat functions. All of the speakers will hopefully leave sort of 5 or so minutes at the end of their sessions, and I'll try and pull out some key themes from the questions. The other thing is, and for the speakers, thanks in advance to all of our speakers for really giving their time and input today. I'll turn my camera and microphone back on just a few minutes before the end of their presentations, so that we know we're coming to the end and that we want to try and make some time for questions and conversation at the end. Other than that, it's the same format as yesterday, so hopefully, again, patience all around when we're using technology such as this, as we all have experienced, I think, over the last couple of months. It's not always as reliable as you'd like it to be, but hopefully we'll all go smoothly today as we did yesterday. So first up, it's my pleasure to introduce Justine Gilliland, the Chief Exec of Venture Taranaki, and it's great to have Justine here this morning. You'll be able to see she's speaking to us from a sunny Taranaki with some nice plants in the background, making me feel jealous about being in my office at home. And Justine's going to talk to us about the Taranaki story and how the region sort of initially responded to the COVID crisis. So Justine, welcome, and over to you.
Thanks, Patrick. Morena koutou, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity to have a chat with you all this morning. I'm just going to share my screen. Apologies while this just takes a couple of minutes. There we are. Hopefully that's all working for everybody. So yeah, Morena, I'm just going to talk to what we've been doing in Taranaki basically since lockdown. But first of all, I'll just kick off with a little bit about Taranaki. So if people aren't aware of much of the sort of detail about our region. So population of nearly 120,000 people, about 15,000 businesses. We do have the second highest GDP per capita in New Zealand, but our average household income is below the New Zealand average. Also, nicely, our house prices are below the New Zealand average as well. So in terms of key sectors, energy is obviously a key sector for us, as well as the food and fibre sector, in particular dairy and sheep and beef, nearly 500,000 animals. And we also are quite specialised in manufacturing and as well as an increasing technology sector. And as those of you who've had the privilege of visiting Taranaki, or maybe even from here, you may know that, yeah, we have a fantastic lifestyle, stunning gardens, with our garden festival in particular in November. Lots of creative people, so a strong history of art and creativity in the region, very fertile land and loads of sunshine. But beneath that surface, we do have some challenges in our region. So we have a NEETs rate in Taranaki, so not an education, employment or training rate for young people that is higher than the New Zealand average. We do have proportionately more school leavers without at least NCEA 3 than the New Zealand average. And we have, in terms of our skills and talent, we have a sort of a bookended piece where we've got higher percentages of people who are under 15 and who are over 65. So that does mean that we do have some skill shortages. And then in particular, something that high per capita GDP rate disguises is that we do have quite significant child poverty challenges in Taranaki. So we're worse than the national average in 8 of the 9 key measures. And in 3 of those measures, we are the worst in New Zealand. And all of those involve material hardship for our children. We also have a great high population of Māori in Taranaki, so obviously a key place for New Zealand wars, very significant Māori population, but that population experiencing significant inequity, so higher unemployment, lower skills, high percentage of a young workforce, and that means, of course, that they are really, really critical to our future as a region. So in terms of that future for our region, this is our roadmap for Taranaki 2050. This is what the people of our region would like to see our region be like in 2050. So this is a kind of intergenerational vision that was co-created by the people of the region. So we had thousands of people kind of involved in workshops and online engagement with this picture, as well as about kind of 70,000 people involved through social media. So in terms of this roadmap and the overall vision that the people of Taranaki want to have is that we want a region that leads the way in New Zealand in terms of low emissions energy technology. People want to have affordable houses and homes that are free of violence. People want to have education options that move and flex with a changing world and that reflect a lifelong learning approach. So not just training for younger people, but ongoing training and learning that adapts and fits with people's work styles and careers. People also want the kind of prosperity that many of the people and the lifestyle that many of the people in our region enjoy today to still be to still be there, but be more equitably shared, so available for all, basically. So everyone sharing more in that prosperity and that lifestyle. So that's our sort of overall vision that's guiding our work as a region and where we want to shift to. And then we were well on track with developing action plans and everything like that for that roadmap. So we've got 12 pathways in that roadmap and action plans for all 12 of them that have just been completed. But of course in March along came this little virus with a really big impact. And what did we do in immediate response? So in Event Taranaki, we felt that one of the biggest impacted spaces would be small and medium enterprises. So basically within 5 days of that lockdown announcement, we designed a local fund to support enterprises. So we're very grateful for support from our local councils who came to the party, and that meant that we were able to make available a $400 grant for any enterprise of 100 FTE or fewer, where they could access professional advice basically for free, so $400 worth of professional advice. And then we had a whole lot of local professional firms who we did a big ring around, and again, hugely grateful to the local professional firms that came on board. We ended up with nearly 60 firms participating, and they matched that contribution in time. So there was a total of $800 professional advisory support available to any COVID-19 impacted enterprise. And that local fund, we closed on the 30th of June. We completely exhausted it, and we overall issued a significant amount of those grants. So it was a really great initiative that we were very, as I say, very appreciative of the support we got from councils and local professional firms. that really made a big difference to local enterprises. The feedback we've had from enterprises is that that advice and support was really invaluable as they were adjusting to being in lockdown or trying to pivot to running businesses online, etc. In terms of our regional impact from COVID-19, we undertook a few different surveys. So we did a survey during lockdown, 144 enterprises. We did our standard business survey in June 2020. So this is a business survey that Venture Taranaki has been running for about 20 years now. So we've got good historical data and a good spread of enterprises across the sectors. And obviously in that survey, this time we included a special COVID-19 impact section. And we also undertook a survey of our Māori enterprises. So in terms of the results from that, this was quite a different result to the business survey that we did in December last year, where there was lots of positivity. People were experiencing huge skill shortages. About 80% of our firms said that they were looking to take on, either take on more staff or increase staff. So unfortunately that, almost reversed, and we've obviously had big concerns from enterprises around revenue slowing or ceasing, the amount of stress and anxiety that they're experiencing, and cash flow difficulties, ongoing financial viability really, really increasing. One of the interesting things that we also found was that in comparison to all enterprises, Māori enterprises did feel slightly more resilient. So you'll see on the right-hand side of the screen there that there were no Māori enterprises who felt that they had been devastated and were not sure if they would be able to continue. And they also had a higher proportion of enterprises saying that they were not significantly impacted by COVID. So that's very encouraging in terms of those Māori enterprises, because it is an area of growth and that we want to be able to support. In terms of impact on our sector, and this is taken from some work that we got Infometrics to do, but also the data that we continually assess at Venture Taranaki. So least impacted, obviously groceries, everyone's still buying food. Quite a significant shift to online purchasing. Really importantly for our region, and I think, for New Zealand as a whole, the agriculture and food, so basically that food and fibre sector really continuing fairly strongly. And that I think, has really stood our region, but New Zealand as a whole, in quite good stead. And then also for us, and I think in other regions as well, are experiencing this. So big construction least impact at the moment. So we've still got lots and lots of construction occurring. Our district council, for example, in New Plymouth, their averaging of resource consents is up quite significantly from last year in terms of the numbers of consents coming through. And then on the flip side, again, probably not huge surprises here, similar to other regions I expect in terms of impact on tourism, accommodation, hospitality, impact on bricks and mortar retail as opposed to online retail, and the international education space. One thing that probably is perhaps slightly unique for Taranaki is that we've had a kind of a double whammy in terms of COVID and also a significant world oil price reduction. So for our energy sector, a bit of a double hit, unfortunately. In terms of our overall enterprise support, so between that that local fund and the Regional Business Partner Program through NZTE, we have had over 5,000 COVID-19 interactions and inquiries, and we've distributed just over $1 million in that enterprise support funding. And you can see a bit of a breakdown on the right-hand side of what that's made up of. Also, interestingly, we have had 80% of our survey respondents had accessed the wage or leave subsidies for staff. And we're starting to see some of the impact of that, of those wage subsidies starting to come off now as people are making plans about what their enterprise looks like going forward. We also instigated what we called ahead of the curve webinars. So these were webinars where we got people with particular expertise to do short, sharp sound bites sort of only 20-30 minute webinars where they're giving people tips about whether it was engaging with your workforce, whether it was about how to implement a digital marketing strategy, whatever it might be, short, sharp webinars that provided direct advice and support for enterprises. And those were very popular. And we also had one live event once we got down to level 1, and we're about to have another live event in Mental Health Week, which will be focused on mental health. Whoops. This is very... Apologies. That has got, sorry about that. That's got very sensitive little mouse. So one of the other things that we did quite quickly, once we were able to, we designed this in lockdown, then when we moved to level 1, we instigated a Go Local campaign. And so that was about encouraging the Taranaki community to think about who they're spending with and to spend local. And by local, we meant if not Taranaki, then at least New Zealand. And also a little bit of education for the Taranaki community on why that mattered or why that would help. That campaign went really, really well. In terms of our retail statistics, we had kind of consistently 7 to 8% retail spend above what the levels were last year. And that was compared to a New Zealand average of around about 2 to 3%. So, and that campaign is still going strong, particularly in our smaller towns. So what next? We looked at basically what was the scenario for Taranaki and what were we facing. In some ways, maybe better place perhaps than some other parts of New Zealand, particularly based with that food and fibre sector having quite a significant presence in our region. And also that we think that sort of potential several waves anticipated. So as I talked about before, the wave, I guess, that we're going through at the moment, and we haven't quite seen the full impact yet, I think, is, what happens as the wage subsidies come off. And we have had that impact of the world energy prices, and we're not exactly quite sure how long that's going to remain. Some world energy prices have risen again, but for example, the price for methanol has not. And so we have seen in Taranaki that some projects that were planned have been delayed or even cancelled. So a lot of questions to be thinking about, and we've had a significant increase in our job seeker numbers. And I spotted Gloria, who is our MSD Regional Commissioner, on this call. So we're working very closely with Gloria and her team, and they are doing a fantastic job in terms of actually keeping some people even off that job seeker number in terms of rapidly finding them new jobs. In terms of the feedback from our enterprises, you can see that this is taking our Venture Taranaki business survey over the years. And so you can see that red line, which is the number of people who think that the New Zealand economic outlook over the next 12 months is going to deteriorate, took a massive increase, very sharp uptick in May, unfortunately, and the line of people who felt that it was going to remain the same, that orange line taking a really sharp decline. So it'll be interesting to see what our next survey, which we'll conduct in December, will see. We'll find out, but yeah, obviously a lot of nervousness and concern, a lot of uncertainty from enterprises. And so what did we then do? So we thought that, we've got all these initiatives that we immediately put in place in terms of enterprise support and Go Local and those sorts of things, but we also needed to look forward to what do we want to do to ensure that as a region we've got a kind of a wider strategy, a plan in place, and that we're also actually continuing to look to that vision that we've set out for ourselves as a region in the Taranaki 2050 roadmap. So we went through a process where we looked at all of the actions in our economic and regional strategies. We had an impact framework that kind of put it through a COVID lens based on what we thought would be most impacted or need the most attention. And then what came out of that is our Return to Better Taranaki Tactical Plan. So this is made up of three really core pillars. which are smart connected communities and enterprises, the importance of that food and fibre sector that I talked about, but real focus on accelerating the value add and value capture, and continuing to advance our energy transition and lead that low emissions energy space that we've talked about. It's kind of bookended by 2 phases. So the ramp up phase, which is what we talked about before around the Go Local campaign, the enterprise support, also some things that we're doing around kind of procure local campaign, and also obviously the government's shovel ready projects, council projects, etc. And then on the right hand side, a sort of the other bookend around a kind of what might be the biggest, like big impact potential projects. So keeping an eye open to what might be the, you know, really, really big opportunities that come along. And then underpinning all of these is a link with our iwi COVID-19 plan, and also a really important foundation of vibrancy. And that's about supporting our hospitality sector, our creative sector, and our tourism sector, as well as the increasing work that iwi and Māori and Taranaki are doing around telling their own story and bringing their culture to the fore. So we developed that tactical plan. It's got a range of actions sitting underneath all of those pillars, many of which are already underway. But what's really critical about that, as I said, is that this is all still aligned to our Taranaki 2050 vision that we're working towards. A little bit of list of some of the projects that we've got underway. Obviously people are probably well aware of the latest announcement about the Green School, which I would confirm is not a school that's about planting crystals. It's actually quite an interesting school model based around entrepreneurship in basically a green environmental way. Then some fantastic other projects in terms of riparian planting, some investment in another entrepreneurial high school that we have here, Spotswood College, some work on roading projects, quite a cool project around replacing our district council's thermal dryer facility with hydrogen power, so that we're one of the few regions in New Zealand that does this, which basically not to find a point on it, basically turns people's poos into fertilizer. And so instead of it being a diesel generated, powered facility, it'll be a hydrogen powered facility. Then investment into Yarrow Stadium, and some work in Stratford around a swimming pool, our South Taranaki Library Cults and Arts Centre, and also they're all listed there. I'm not going to go through them all, but another one that's really important though is the Dawson Falls Lodge development. So this is owned by one of our iwi, and it's on the mountain, and it's a beautiful lodge, so it's a fantastic redevelopment there. The other critical thing is for us that's really important are the pre-COVID projects that we want to ensure keep going, keep moving, and they're providing a really important stability over the next kind of 2 to 3 years. And for example, our hospital redevelopment is a really significant project and important for our construction sector here. In terms of what we're doing on the pillar of the tactical plan about connected communities and enterprises, a lot of it's about that enterprise advice and support that I've talked about, but increasingly what we really want to focus on as well is entrepreneurship and intrapreneurship. So we're looking to support and develop our ecosystem in Taranaki that supports entrepreneurs, and that's both about, you know, kind of startups, but also importantly about existing small and medium enterprises that have the opportunity to pivot, to grow, etc. And how do we support those, that kind of entrepreneurship focus, I guess. Another critical point on skills, so thinking about how as a region we can make sure that we are attracting and retaining people we need, and also ensuring that there are opportunities available for people to undertake education and training, and thinking too about what that future workforce looks like. And ideally, we're investment in our regional New Zealand Institute of Skills and Technology, the regional branch of that being WIT, is a very important factor for us in that community. In terms of our acceleration pillar and the food and fibre space, we have a project called Branching Out. So this is about looking at potential new land use prospects that build on our current strengths and basically add to or complement those strengths. And importantly, though, considers the entire value chain. So it's really about those value-added products. And also some work that we're doing with, for example, farmer-led groups around sustainability, a big focus and massive enthusiasm here that's growing around regenerative agriculture and supporting that. And then importantly, linking food and tourism together. In terms of future energy, we have Araake launch, so that is the National New Energy Development Centre. So we launched that in July, and we're very, looking forward really to the first projects that start to come out of there. We're continuing our focus on hydrogen, and there's been some great further investment from the government in the hydrogen space. So particularly looking at hydrogen transport, which is really important for heavy vehicle use. We published an offshore wind paper during lockdown, and that has generated significant interest internationally as well as domestically. So that's a significant opportunity for our region. And then overall looking at our energy ecosystem, partnerships, clusters, etc. And then in terms of that vibrancy underpinning, we've got a whole lot of work underway with mainly led by our council and our arts community to really support our creative sector. We're undertaking obviously visitor sector campaigns as many other regions are. We have a regional event strategy that we've just launched, and we have a big focus as well on attracting investment into our region. So I guess the overall underpinning for us is that we're doing all of this work, but critically through all of that, it's about still maintaining the focus on the long term and progressing towards our Taranaki 2050 vision. So COVID-19 has come along. It has, I guess, perhaps made us speed some things up, but it's really important for us that it doesn't actually distract or detract from that overall vision of where we want to be and where we want to head. So I think I might have left like 2 minutes of questions.
Yes, just enough, but I could see you were coming to the end with the slides there, Justine. So, and we did start a couple of minutes late after the introduction, so I thought I'd let you finish. So look, a couple of quick questions that have sort of come through. So it'd probably be no surprise when I say that a lot of people obviously love the roadmap, the visualization of where you want to go. And I think those messages around how do you keep that kind of focus on, we've got some long-term objectives that we've all agreed that we're moving towards, we can't lose sight of them. But you've also detailed quite a significant work program, some of which I can see from previous work is kind of strongly aligned to that vision. But has anything changed? So is there anything that was either less important previously that you now see as more important? Is there anything new that's sort of come in and has the sort of, I guess, the direction that you need to take to get to that long-term vision when you talk about just transitions, vibrancy, etc.? Is there anything feels different now?
I think probably one of the things that would be slightly different is that we very much had that strong focus on entrepreneurship and wanted to be bringing that through in our entrepreneurship ecosystem, but we were very focused on startups. And so a shift for us has been ensuring that ecosystem is also about supporting existing small and medium enterprises. So the ones that have that potential to pivot or that real potential for growth. So that's, I guess, looking not only at entrepreneurship, but at entrepreneurship as well. So that's been one shift, which is, I guess, is sort of additive as opposed to taking something away. Probably one of the other areas that I was going to talk about, and now it's just gone out of my head. Sorry.
All right, well, I'll ask the next one, and then you might come back to it.
Tourism, sorry, obviously very interested in the work of the Tourism Futures Task Force, and we're doing a piece of work thanks to the STAT funding. We're taking a design thinking approach and looking at what are the experiences that tourists might want, and then how in terms of our strengths as a region, can we deliver to those experiences? So thinking about it really from a user design perspective, perhaps, as opposed to a more marketing push perspective. Yeah, so
makes sense.
Another shift. Yeah.
And are there other sectors of importance that might have changed for you? So there's a question about, given your outstanding land and soil qualities and the issues around food sustainability and supply chain, obviously you've got that focus on kind of food and fibre. Has that become something which is where you see more opportunities or greater opportunities going forward?
That's always been a huge one for us. So that hasn't really changed. I think what for us at Bench Tamaki, I think what possibly has changed is, which is fantastic, I think, is actually the general public's understanding of the value of that food and fibre sector to New Zealand, that it basically is still, it's the biggest export sector. What tourism might say, when you add the food and fibre sector together, it is about 3 times the size of the tourism sector. So, it's still hugely important to New Zealand. And so I think it's probably more that people are more conscious of that. Whereas for us, it's always been a really, really critical,
very important one.
Yeah.
Yes, that helps. And then I guess very, very last quick one. Obviously, digital enablement, again, always a priority for you, particularly in a region that's as diverse and spread out as Taranaki. Has that become something which is, you need particular needs around infrastructure and particular importance with companies trading online? Are those the sort of things that, your companies in that kind of COVID response have kind of started to wake up to?
It's so there's a little bit about infrastructure, but I think the piece about infrastructure it's probably it's as important as it was before. What we have more discovered actually is that the really critical focus is on the digital skills. So it's the actual skills of the enterprise to be able to operate in a digital environment. And there isn't actually a lot of kind of support or programs available for enterprises around that. So we're very interested in what MB is looking at doing there, and also there's some quite cool stuff that DIA are looking at doing, particularly with Māori and Pacific Island and disability-owned enterprises. So I think that'll be really exciting to see where that goes and what support that can pull forward for enterprises.
Yeah, definitely. Justine, thank you very much for your time this morning. Great presentation as always. And I think, I guess I said, everybody loves the roadmap, so it's great to see that's continuing. Right. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks. So our next speaker this morning is Peter Harris, and Peter is the Economic Development Manager at Queenstown Lake District Council. Obviously been right in the middle of the change, given the sort of the impacts that we've all seen for a tourism and visitor economy. And so there's probably nobody better to talk about how how that felt and how you've responded to. So Peter, great to have you, and I'll hand over to you now.
Thanks, Patrick. I'll just share my screen. So this morning I'm going to talk about, I guess, the journey of the Queenstown Lakes District from where we were a couple of years ago to where we are now, and some lessons along the way. Now, I don't have any pie charts, but I thought I would start with a pie in case you needed something to keep going, and I don't have any bar graphs. But we started with a bar. So I deliberately tried to avoid any statistics and graphs for you today to try and give you a bit of a break from those, because I suspect you probably had a fair few of them. So in terms of where we started, we were pretty much sitting pretty prior to this. We had 3 times the growth in population to the national average. We had 3 times the GDP growth than the national average, and 3 times the job growth. And so, things were pretty sweet in terms of, if you wanted a job, there were 27 people on our job seeker benefit here in February. In terms of investment, we had more investor migrants than any other district other than Auckland. So in lots of ways, we were sort of, from an economic development point of view, I was dealing with a situation that was the envy of lots of places. Just to give you a little bit of background in terms of the economic development structure here, there wasn't anybody doing economic development other than tourism marketing until 2017, when I took a new role. And even now, there are 3 times more people doing tourism marketing than anything else in the economic development space. Not only were we sitting pretty, but we were actually a shop front for the rest of the country. Martin Jenkins did some work probably about 18 months ago now that showed that if an international visitor came to Queenstown, they basically spent 3 times more in the rest of the South Island than an international visitor who didn't come to Queenstown. And Queenstown and the tourism industry, in terms of the overflow from us, it's as big as the high-tech manufacturing sector in terms of jobs, and it creates as much GDP as the whole of the wine industry. On the surface of it, it all looked really good, but we were dealing with a lot of the pressures from growth. So in terms of dependence, our district was the most dependent on one industry of any district in the country. About 60% of our economy was reliant on tourism, and of that, 60% of that was reliant on international visitors. Those visitors bring stress in terms of infrastructure. So again, Martin Jenkins did some work to show that for every 1 resident in our district, we were hosting 34 international visitors a year. And not only that, they didn't arrive evenly across the year. They came at particular times. So we were building, or have to build, infrastructure for the peaks. So there are a couple of weeks a year where basically all the engineers are building our infrastructure to be able to cope with. Productivity, we're on average about 13% less productive GDP per worker than the national average, and that reflected in wages. And then in terms of affordability, we're a third less affordable than the national average. So the wages were relatively low, the cost of living here was high, and that, I guess, the community reacted to that. So the Mood of the Nation research that does a sort of a pulse check on what people's perceptions of tourism are. About 8 out of 10 people in our district had the opinion that international visitors were causing too much pressure on our community, and that's about twice what the national average was. Not only that, in terms of economic development, as I mentioned before, we had a lot of effort going into tourism marketing. When you add it up, we had 7 different organisations doing business development and economic development in different forms. 2 chambers in a small district, 2 RTOs. So we were well endowed with people sitting around governance tables doing bits of economic development. We were making some inroads on that in terms of the dependence on tourism. We've been supporting the film industry and the education industry for a while here. In the last couple of years, we've started a startup community, which is going really strongly, and there are a number of non-tourism businesses which are actually really thriving and been doing really well out of our district. It's a bit of a hidden story, but there are businesses like MedRecruit, which does locum sourcing for the medical industry. Those sorts of businesses have been hidden away, and we haven't really told the story about the fact that there's other things happening here, but they were happening. The Infrastructure Council had about $1 billion spent in its 10-year plan, and we're in the process of working with government to look at putting in a bed tax, which would have helped subsidise that infrastructure cost that is put on the residents by the international visitors. Affordability, we had a housing trust, and each of the subdivisions had to give a proportion of its land across to the housing trust for affordable housing. And in terms of social licence, we worked with our community to build a Vision 2050 that was, I guess, a community-built vision of where they wanted to go, and we're lining up all our work underneath that. So we were getting there, and then this happened. So this isn't Mike Tyson, obviously, but Mike Tyson has a quote that says, "Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth." And I guess that's the situation that we were in when COVID hit. In terms of the potential impact of that, in April we had Infometrics do some analysis to work out what the impact might be. Their prediction was that 1 in 4 of our workers could lose their jobs. and that would be the highest job rate of anywhere except for Mackenzie Country, which obviously is much smaller but has a really strong percentage of tourism in it. Just as a comparison, the Tiwai closure is threatening 1,000 jobs directly and another 1,500 jobs indirectly. So the impact in terms of job losses could be three Tiwai points for us. Now, we held out hope for a bubble. Somebody said to me when I did a run through earlier on, they said it looks like a crystal ball, and I guess we were looking for both of them. The stress of the uncertainty and the bubbles coming and going have taken a huge toll on our business community and our workers in terms of just not knowing what's happening next. But we've sort of, I guess, moved away from the talk about the bubble. In terms of what council did, we are in a situation where there was no government support for the migrants. We estimate around 7,000 migrant workers in the district, a mix of sponsored workers and ones on working holiday visas. So we needed to make sure that they had food to put on the table. So we set up basically from scratch a social welfare system from within council. We had 7,000 registrations of individual people who asked for help. We gave away about $2.5 million worth of food vouchers. In terms of businesses, our regional business partners have done more support of businesses in the last few months than they've done in the previous 8 years. We also recognised that there were a lot of people stressed about trying to get access to information online. So we stood up a hub called Kia Kaha, and we had 1,100 people come through that, and about 3,000 people look at our online videos. And we had immigration turn up, and so people really appreciated being able to talk to the immigration people, for instance, face to face. We had travel agents there talking about repatriation, and we ran some sessions for employers as well. A lot of them were concerned about their migrant staff and what information they could share with them about what the options were. There were glimmers of hope and some sunny days, and those sunny days were really based around the school holidays. So really, I guess the employers didn't know what was going to happen over those school holidays, but we actually ended up with much stronger demand over that period than we had anticipated. And in fact, some of the employers were struggling to find staff to be able to cope. So that was really encouraging, and people had lifted spirits over that time. But there were still storm clouds on the horizon. The job subsidy was masking the pain, the estimated job losses so far in terms of COVID payment and MSD. The job seeker allowance is up to about 1,000. We estimate there's probably another 400 or 500 that are unemployed that have potentially left the district. And spending's down about 26%. So things we're working on in response. We came together with the two chambers and the two RTOs pretty much on day one, and at the start we were meeting daily to make sure that we were putting out one set of information to our business community rather than every organisation having a different interpretation of what was going on. They really appreciated that, and now we still meet once a week to make sure that carries on. We have put in place an idea management system and created two groups, one short-term and one long-term, of external experts to try and help guide our recovery response. Redeployment, there are a limited number of options for redeployment within the district, but we're working alongside Central Otago and other neighbouring districts around opportunities for people here to potentially get some seasonal work in horticulture and viticulture and agriculture. And there's also jobs in nature, which I'll talk about a little bit later. One of our concerns was that because this district isn't necessarily the long-term or family home for a lot of people, that we would run the risk of hollowing out our community. So we've started a retention project, not only to retain key staff for employers, but also retain key people within the community. So for instance, if all your firefighters lose their jobs and move away, then you've got a major issue. One of the opportunities from COVID we see is the expats coming back, and we're about to start a campaign around encouraging those who might have been thinking about coming back to our district to retire, to come back early and build a team around them and create some jobs that way. It sort of seems weird that we haven't had a destination management plan before now, and we're now kicking that off, partly using some of the money that the RTOs have been given by MB. And I guess part of the reason that that's possible now is that some of the silos that were there before have been broken down, and people, I guess, are having more honest conversations and about what roles we all play in destination management. So, I mean, there are some positives that are coming out of COVID. And we were doing work in diversification, but we're working on the idea of it being economic insurance for whatever happens in the future, in terms of a future blow to the tourism industry. And we're trying to calculate, I guess, what that premium should be, accepting that it's a long-term premium, because it's none of these diversification things are going to happen in a moment. So what I've tried to do, I guess, is sort of summarise some of the lessons that we've sort of taken from being in the eye of the storm here. One of them is you need to be careful who you talk to. So there are a lot of businesses and a lot of individuals who are basically still in the bleeding all over the floor stage. All they're looking for is an ambulance and some quick, fast pain relief and some certainty about what happens tomorrow. There's another part of our community that's going, this is a great time to rejuvenate and relook at, reset, particularly in the tourism sense. And I think those of us that are thinking about that need to be really careful and respectful of those people who are just trying to get through. So it's just trying to work out who you're talking to and what sort of scale of conversation is valid. Our mayor has had dozens and dozens of people come with solutions to the future of the district, and one of the local media organisations ran an idea competition pretty early on. They got over 100 ideas, but there's a Japanese saying that says vision without action is a daydream, and I think that, I guess, our experience is that of all of those ideas that have been coming to us, less than 10% have people that are going to drive them forward. And so we have an idea management system that we're putting in place to try and A, encourage ideas in a focused way, but B, encourage the community to step up and make them happen. One of the things that we've been swamped with, really, to be honest, is people wanting to know what's going on the ground. So whether it's business surveys or spending or whatever, we're doing our best there, but my concern, I guess, a little bit is that the weather is not the climate. And I believe from an economic development point of view, our job is to look at the climate and to look over the horizon and work out what we need to be doing now. I think if we're not careful, we can spend too much time looking at the weather. We've worked really closely with DOC and our regional council on the Jobs and Nature program, and we co-funded a pilot working with one of the tourism operators who wanted to be able to redeploy their staff across to Jobs and Nature and to do that alongside other tourism operators. That's coming to an end, and to be honest, there will be a gap between that and DOC getting its spending sorted. I think probably the realisation we came to is that DOC and the other organisations that got that Jobs and Nature money were looking at it as Jobs and Nature being nature and capitals, and our concern with the severity of the job losses that are already happening but are likely to happen is that we want to be focused on the jobs as soon as possible, because the danger is that people will leave the district and not come back. It's quite interesting. There's been a few people who have, as I said before, there's a lot of organisations in our district that have been playing in the economic development space, and some people have said, oh, look, we need to change the structure and we need to get an independent EDA. I guess my concern about that is that when you're in the middle of a storm, you need all hands on deck, and it's really not the time to be designing a new boat, even though the boat looks much sexier than the other one. And then I guess just dwelling on what we're here for, in the end, we can't save jobs or make jobs. we can't save businesses, and what our job is to help people make better decisions and make the soil as ready as we can make it for giving those decisions the best chance of catching wind and growing. So I think we need to be realistic about what we can and can't achieve, because this is going to be a long game. This crisis is not going away in a hurry, and our feeling for this district anyway is we haven't seen the worst of it yet. In terms of Queenstown Lakes, I think there's some things we can take heart from. You know, we've been here before, so this is, if any of you have been up Skipper's Canyon, this is the Skipper's School picnic. So now nobody lives there at all. So we've been here, we've been boomed and busted before. And as Cheryl Crow said, no one said it would be easy, and no one said it would be this hard. That's going through into the Nevis. So, I mean, this is a harsh environment, and people have survived here for a very long time, and they'll carry on doing that. This is our mayor, and we will bounce back, and we do, and we have done before. So previous crises, Queenstown Lakes District has bounced back pretty quickly. And I guess in the end, this is still a remarkable place to live. And that's what will get us through. I think people choosing to live here and grow a future here is really what we're focusing in on, and what will pull us through. So that's my presentation. Happy to take any questions.
Thanks very much, Peter, and thanks for all of the work you're doing. Obviously, it's a remarkably hard situation that you're working through as well. So it's really good to hear the range of activity that you've got underway and got planned. I guess a couple of questions that occur to me. So talked about, this is obviously, we hear a lot about this is the opportunity to build back better. And you've outlined some of the dimensions for Queenstown of what that might look like. But you also talked about, as we all see, this sort of all the idea storms that come in. So all of the things that people think need to be done. As you say, I like your quote, I often use the one, a vision without a budget is a hallucination. So there's kind of, you know, there's lots of things that could be done to build back better. And you talked about how you manage the ideas that are coming in. Could you just tell us a little bit more about how you're trying to take all of those voices that have all got that kind of commitment to seeing a better future for Queenstown, but you have to pick it up and kind of start somewhere? How are you sort of approaching that?
Yeah, so we've put in a program called Torakiki using an online system whereby we've posed 3 questions and asked the community to engage with those 3 questions. And so we'll do so there's been a six-week round of engaging with the community on those 3 questions, and then we'll repeat that going forward. I guess the goal there is to focus people's minds on issues that are worth fixing, rather than just any idea is a good idea. So the media outlet that did it early on was sort of just send us your ideas, and very few of those are getting traction simply because people saw it as a suggestion box. So I think, yeah, you've got to have a process and you've got to be patient, and I think you want to try and ask questions worth asking.
Yeah, I think that's some good messages, because as I say, it's I think a challenge that we all face. The second point I was going to raise was the extent to which you've had dialogue with other locations globally that perhaps in a similar situation to you. So, you know, your situation in New Zealand is probably, you know, at the extreme in terms of how reliant you have been on that sector and how strong it was, whereas a lot of the other regions have relied perhaps more on some of the domestic tourism, not just international, and they've got other sort of strengths. And as you've said, your diversification strategy is going to be important. But presumably there's other locations globally that have been facing the similar sort of situation as you. And is there much dialogue going on? And is there anything that you're learning which you would apply in Queenstown from that dialogue?
Yeah, we haven't had a lot of dialogue. We're part of a webinar that E4 ran a couple of weeks ago, and that was, I don't know whether it was heartening or depressing or both, really, to be honest, that others are in a similar sort of situation. I think we have done and this was pre-COVID, we did a bit of diversification stock take and looked at other places around the world that have been in a situation of being very dominated by one industry. And I guess the conclusion there, and it's no surprises, is that it's a long haul out. It's a long haul to reduce that dependence. But yeah, so I think the reality is we are always going to be a visitor orientated district. But I think the other side of it that I'm really interested in is how do we take that shop front and use it in different ways? So at the moment, we concentrate on how much people spend when they're here. I'm interested in the lifetime value of that visitor. And that's a hard thing to measure, but I think we really need to start digging into it.
Yeah, that's interesting. And Susan's asked a question which I think relates, sort of builds upon that, in that obviously the council's been traditionally quite focused on supporting that tourism sector for obvious reasons, as you've indicated. And so has this sort of shock, how has it changed their view of that sort of importance of diversification, that sort of long-term alternative futures?
I think that's still playing out, to be honest. Council's taken a real financial hit because it owns 3/4 of the airport, for instance, and it'll get a much smaller, if any, dividend out of that. So we've probably taken about a $20 million hit. So that means you've got these options. I think the other side of it is that you've got a lot of the tourism industry who have a very strong voice and are just basically looking for anything that can give them short-term pain relief. So I think it's again, on one hand, depending on what side of the fence you sit, you'd go, well, isn't it obvious you'd be putting more money into diversification? But A, council's got less money overall, and B, you've got some pretty strong voices around the importance of helping tourism recover.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, we wish you best of luck. It's been, I'm sure this won't be the last time we hear from you, because I know there's a lot of work going on. So thank you very much for your time this morning, and we hope to speak to you soon.
Cheers. Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks. So our next speaker this morning, and the final speaker before we break, is Professor Sean Hendy. Sean probably needs no introduction to some of you, given both his previous work in working with Sir Paul Callaghan around Get Off the Grass, which many of you will be familiar, but then he's obviously been very visible over the last few months in terms of offering sort of perspectives and insight and data related to the impact of COVID and how we should be responding. And I'm really pleased that we've been able to get Sean this morning for this presentation. I certainly myself always enjoy hearing about some of Sean's work and the work of his colleagues. So it's great to have you here this morning, Sean, and welcome to Economic Development New Zealand Congress.
Kia ora, Patrick. Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with you today. And also the topic is one that's sort of been in the back of my mind ever since the outbreak. You know, I was asked to talk about how ready we were for COVID-19. And so this talk has been a good excuse for me to get some of my thoughts together. Of course, I have been thinking about this quite a lot, but I haven't really had an opportunity to organize my thoughts. So let me get my screen sharing going. And then we can get into it. Okay, so I'm going to assume everybody can see my screen.
Yes.
If you can't, let me know. Yeah, so I'm going to reflect, and you know, these are quite early thoughts. And obviously, when I was asked to do this, we didn't know about the second outbreak, and so you know, I think it's fair to say that for the second wave, the second outbreak that we're dealing with at the moment, we have been much better prepared. Some of the things that were worked out in March and April have actually paid dividends this time around. I'm not going to reflect on that so much. I'm really going to step back and look at the situation back in March and April to give you my thoughts on how well we entered into that crisis, because I think that's probably more important for our longer term planning. You know, it's good that we've done a few things around our public health system in the interim that meant we're perhaps how to cope better with this outbreak that we're now facing. But I think I wanted to take a longer term perspective. So let me just tell you about Te Punaha Matatini. So that's the research centre that I lead, that's been heavily involved in the modelling. And of course this is mostly what I've been talking about when I've been in the media, and this has really dominated my life for the last 6 months. So Te Punaha Matatini, it's a tertiary education commission funded research centre, and we focus on complex systems, and we've been around since 2015, and there's about 80 active researchers engaged around the country, whether they're in universities, Crown Research Institutes, and several independent research organisations. And we don't have a specific domain focus. We work quite broadly across a range of different problems. It's a multidisciplinary centre, but we're focused on things like data and modelling. And as I said, we work across a range of domains: social problems, economic problems, and ecological problems. And if you had told me that we'd be actively involved in a pandemic response a year ago, I wouldn't have been that surprised, even though it wasn't one of our core areas, because we have done some work since we were set up in 2015 on infectious disease. So most recently, we've worked on the M. bovis response with the Ministry of Primary Industries, providing some modelling support there. We've also done projects on seasonal influenza in New Zealand, and we've looked at the Havelock North gastro outbreak. So it's not surprising to us that we've been involved, but I think probably it has been surprising the extent to which we've been involved. So I might talk about that a bit towards the end, but mainly I want to focus on the sort of national picture for how that worked. So of course, New Zealand does have a pandemic plan. So that's the latest iteration of our pandemic plan was put together in 2017, and actually that was related. One of the reasons we did the work on seasonal influenza was related to the development of this pandemic plan. But it was developed for a very specific type of illness, which I'll talk about in a moment. And it's really based around what we'd now call a flatten the curve strategy. Okay, so most people are familiar with that phrase now, because that's how we were talking about the epidemic very early on in March, right? But flattening the curve is we're going to try and mitigate the spread of the disease to a sufficient extent that our healthcare system copes, right? That's the big challenge with one of these large outbreaks, is that if a significant number of people require hospitalization or treatment in ICU, right, then you can easily overwhelm your healthcare system, and then people don't get the treatment that they need, right? And this can lead to a much higher fatality rate. And so our national pandemic plan basically describes a flatten the curve strategy. It's got a number of phases in it, and you'll be familiar with the keep it out and stamp it out phases. Again, these were things that were discussed very early on as we dusted off the pandemic plan and put it into play in February and March. But crucially, it requires really rapid decision making. If you're going to move and use these phases effectively, keeping it out and stamping it out, right, you need to make rapid decisions, and you need to implement things in this plan at sufficiently early stages. Okay, and it does anticipate uncertainty and a lack of reliable information. But I think one of the things, when I go back and look at the plan now, is it really fails to consider how we're going to integrate new science or new knowledge about the epidemic. So while acknowledging the great deal of uncertainty that we'd face and the lack of information on which to make decisions, doesn't really come to grips with how, in the event, we would face up to that. And of course, that turned out to be particularly important for COVID-19. And so I've got here kind of three three diseases that we often talk about when we're comparing COVID-19 with what we were thinking about or other diseases that we've planned for or experienced. So the pandemic plan is really adapted for what we call pandemic influenza, right? And so this would be similar to the H1N1 flu that we had in 2009, or even going back to the 1918 pandemic, which of course most people know about, was a most significant recent pandemic. And you know, each disease has its particular characteristics. So if I think about the 2009 pandemic, right? So a very important number, and again, I can almost assume that most of you will be familiar with this number because of how much it's been discussed recently, is the reproduction number of the virus, right? So this is, if you get infected, on average, how many people are you going to go on and infect, right? And so for our 2009 pandemic influenza, that was about 1.7. Another important number is the incubation period. How long does it take from you being exposed to the virus to developing the disease or symptoms for the disease? So it's about 2 days, and about 2 days after you develop symptoms, you hit peak infectivity, right? So this is so about 4 days after exposure is when you're most likely to infect other people. Most people had a mild illness, right? And then a small number of patients required ICU. So that's the kind of, maybe we were thinking of something more severe than this, but something along these lines was what we were looking to tackle in this pandemic plan. The big curveball with COVID-19 was this, the transmission of the disease by mild or asymptomatic carriers of the disease, right? That's made containment extremely difficult because people with exhibiting no symptoms can actually be highly infectious, and they can pass that on. So actually, many people start to become infectious about 1 to 2 days before they develop symptoms. Right? And this makes controlling the disease much, much harder than the first SARS. Okay, in the first SARS, people were, which was in some ways a much more serious disease. If you caught it, the consequences were much more significant. But the people who were infectious also had very strong symptoms. So it was very easy to spot people when they were infectious because of the symptoms. And so in that sense, it was a much easier disease to contain. With COVID-19, we were dealing with a disease where people were infectious well before they developed symptoms. And that really required us to take a look at this plan and really have to adapt it very early on. Okay, and so that was really where this pivot came from. Was the difficulty of containment, but also it became clear early on that it would likely be impossible to flatten the curve sufficiently. Right, that was becoming clear from the early data that was coming out of China and Italy, and our own assessment of our healthcare system. So really this required a different strategy, right? And so in New Zealand, we went for the strong early lockdown, and that strong early lockdown enabled us to roll out a testing and tracing regime that was highly effective. Of course, in New Zealand, in retrospect, this adopted one of the most effective, it's possible to argue about it, whether it was the most effective, but one of the most effective strategies around the world. And it had a strong effect. So I've just got some data for you here. Again, this is the reproduction number of the disease. Of course, that most of our early cases were from people returning from overseas. One of the interesting things is if you look at this, this is the reproductive number for people coming in from overseas. So actually, it never got above 1. Right? So most people returning from overseas didn't infect more than 1 person. Right? Some people infected no people, but most people were only at best infecting only 1 person. Right? And so it was the the controls and the early warning we had about the disease meant that a lot of people actually went into isolation and didn't pass it on, right? The real spike early on was domestic cases. So it was brought in from overseas. People from overseas passed it on to others, and then it was those people who spread it significantly around New Zealand. And of course, you remember the talk of the clusters that we were dealing with back in March and April, right? And a lot of those happened around mid-March, right? So there's a big spike in this effective reproduction number, right? The number of secondary cases generated by primary cases in March. That did drop off as we became more aware of the disease. And then with lockdown, we were able to push that down and keep it, for most of the time during lockdown, below 1, right? And eventually we got to a stage when we eliminated the disease. You might be interested in these little spikes here in domestic transmission. This was Easter, right? And this was the last long weekend before we exited level 4, right? So there were definitely risky periods during our lockdown when we had some extra spread. But by and large, right, our strategy of lockdown plus the testing, tracing, and isolating was a very effective strategy, and that was an effective pivot to deal with this particular disease. Of course, a big issue from an economic point of view is, and I'm just going to run through a couple of slides now, just sort of talking about some of the issues we face at the moment from an economic point of view. I mean, one is obviously the border. This is a visualization of both travel and prevalence of the disease overseas. This was something that we actually computed in June, and so this will have changed now. But you can see we have risks from Australia, India, the United States. Some of those risks are because of large volumes of travel. So Australia, where overall the prevalence is very low, but we have a large number of travellers coming in from Australia versus, say, the US, where travel volumes are less, but the disease is much more prevalent. Overall, from mid-July to mid-June to mid-July, we had about 10,000 arrivals, right? So that's half an average day. At pre-March levels, we imported 41 cases, right? And so that's about 0.4% of our arrivals. So if we were to open up right now, right? So if we were to go back to normal levels, then we'd be dealing with about 100 cases a day. And the real difficulty is how do you screen or manage that flow? And of course, at the moment, we're using this managed isolation and quarantine process. The real difficulty is with the testing that we have at the moment, right? The current gold standard test, which is the PCR test, which is based on detecting bits of RNA from the virus. The real problem is that at best, it's about it gives you about a 20% false negative rate. So if you're doing tests on people, right, you have to really do multiple tests to catch the disease, right? And this false negative rate also depends on where you are in the course of your disease, right? So you see early on where you could still be infectious, right? And in an infectious period, there's a very high chance that you won't test positive, right? And so this is the difficulty we have around our managed isolation and quarantine facilities at the moment, is we really do need those 14 days as well as multiple tests to really screen visitors effectively. I think there's some hope that with some of the new tests out there, we may be able to manage that better, but that's still an ongoing issue. And then I think another issue at the moment is whether we could be using technology, Bluetooth apps, or card-based detection systems. I won't go into this in detail, but they're not a silver bullet solution, right? An app or a COVID card could make a difference, but it's not a significant enough difference to allow us to relax alert levels, for example, or to avoid going into level 3, right? And a key part of this, part of the reason why is of course, with contact tracing, the key thing is that once a contact is traced, that contact has to go into isolation. And that really requires a hands-on process dealing with public health officials. If people were able to isolate very effectively without the need for support from public health systems, then these apps would be more effective. But the reality is that most people need some kind of support and encouragement to go into effective isolation or quarantine. And so that's one of the reasons why the technology solutions that we've been looking at the moment don't solve all our problems. Okay, so I just want to now sort of reflect on that, the question I was asked to get at, which was really around, you know, were we ready? I mean, I think one key thing is, and I'm gonna separate this into two different buckets. Well, I'm going to look at the science and I'm going to look at the economics. And I think one thing that was really clear and is still an issue is that we lacked an infectious disease centre or some sort of peak scientific body to lead the scientific response. It really has required centres like mine, which are kind of general purpose centres to step up and get involved. And at times it's been really, really difficult coordinating across the different science efforts, because we do lack, you know, we lack the equivalent of the Centres for Disease Control that the US has. And of course, it's arguable as to how well they've been able to perform with the US government. But it's been, at times that's made it really difficult for many of us working in the science response. You know, I will particularly single out, you know, Juliette Gerard, who's the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor, and Ian Town, who's the Chief Science Advisor at Health. A lot of the responsibility for coordinating the science effort has fallen on Juliette and Ian, and they've done very well. But they certainly could have done with a lot more support, particularly early on. And I would say, you know, we've used formal mechanisms like Juliette and Ian, but informal mechanisms have been really important as well. So those are things I think we can learn from and say that we probably didn't have those things right at the outset. I think you know, our decentralized health system has been a real problem. You know, from my point of view, it's very much hindered information sharing. So it's been quite at times very difficult to get good information. And of course, this has been widely discussed in the media. But it's not just scientists like me who found it hard to get good information because of that decentralization. The policy community, so central government in Wellington, has really struggled at times to get good information. And then from a science perspective, you know, I think the science communication has been done very well. I've just got a cartoon, Susie Wiles, who's worked with Toby Morris at the Spinoff. You know, many of you would have seen the work that Susie and Toby had done, and actually Spinoff is now doing science communication for the World Health Organization as a result of that. I think it's been extremely effective, but it's also relied on a great deal of improvisation. And so again, that's something I think we could learn from. Coming back to the economic side of things, so I've been involved in both advising Ministry of Health and working with Treasury. The work I've done with Treasury hasn't involved me being in the media as much. It's been much more behind the scenes, but there has been a lot of work done, and I think it, in some ways it was relatively well scoped in the pandemic plan, and so Treasury did have a path forward that was anticipated in that pandemic plan, right? And you know, here were the goals in the pandemic plan. You know, protect the financial system, formulate macro policy, and then prepare and support firms and households. And I think they've, to a large extent, they've been able to deliver on that. I mean, I think in terms of some of the problems, I think actually we've had pretty weak connection between the economics community and the infectious disease community, and I think that's really hindered economic thinking. A lot of the economic thinking that I've encountered has really struggled with understanding the dynamics of an epidemic, and so I think cost benefit analyses, which I think are starting to be done properly now. I know there's been a lot of early effort on this, right? They really needed to be carried out in conjunction with a fit for purpose epidemic model, and I think because of where we are, right, our unique circumstances, that we were able to put ourselves on an elimination path. This really required a bespoke model solution, not something that you could easily get off the shelf. And I think we've struggled to really to do good cost benefit analyses because we haven't tied in good epidemic models with the economic thinking. And I think going forward, one of the big things with this disease, and indeed with a lot of infectious disease, is that you need to bring a strong equity lens to it. This is some work we've recently done, looking at the risks to different ethnic groups in New Zealand. And you'll note this is the infection fatality rate. So this is the number of people who get infected, the proportion of people who get infected who will go on to die. And you'll note that the risks are very strongly skewed towards Māori and Pacific people. And this is not just the risk of getting infected, multi-generational households and the fact that many Māori and Pacific people work in high contact industries, put them at a great, very high risk. And so I think we've needed to bring that equity lens to the problem in a way that I haven't seen done well yet. So just to sum up, and then I can take some questions. Overall, right, going into this pandemic, I would have liked to have seen better integration of public health and the science communities with policy. I think I've certainly learnt that why that can be a challenge, but I think the better that we can do that, the greater the dividends. And then I think, we really needed to integrate the science more closely with the economics. It's not to say that scientists don't work with economists, but it's certainly been a bit of a handicap that we haven't had close relationships as close as they could be between the public health scientists, people like me doing modelling with the economics community. I do think a public health agency, I know there's been calls for this, or some sort of coordinating body. One of the risks with creating yet another agency is that agencies don't necessarily play good coordinating roles. So some sort of body with a clear coordinating mandate that could bring a strong equity lens, and in particular a Māori public health lens to the problem. Whether that's a standalone agency or integrated into a new agency, I think that could have made a big difference. And this is just my pet peeve. We've obviously to do what we've done, we've had to work very closely with lots of different data sources, and it's still an ongoing headache for us. We really need to have a very searching conversation about data sharing between researchers and agencies, and this is inter-agency, so between agencies and then with researchers as well. That's something that has caused problems and has meant that we haven't always been in a position to make the best decisions. Okay, so I'll wrap up there, and I'm happy to take some questions for a few minutes.
Thanks very much, Sean. Great presentation as usual, and really interesting to see behind some of the things that you've been doing. Couple of questions, one of which was kind of occurring to me, but we've also had a question from Juanita. And so one of the things that I certainly heard during the kind of over the last few months was the notion that the economic impacts, obviously something that we as economic developers are very concerned about, would potentially have been much worse without a lockdown, and certainly without a lockdown that was as kind of, I guess, restrictive as ours was. And when you compare what's happened to and what's been happening to our economy to other places, that would seem to be the case. But is that something you've looked at or have any views upon?
Yeah, look, you know, we did a very rough analysis early on, Patrick, that you know that was the case. I mean, it's not something we've published yet because it was very back of the envelope. And yeah, you know, when you look at the potential scale of, you know, what would an epidemic, how would that play out in Auckland, for example, in autumn or winter? You know, a very large fraction of the economy basically gets shut down. And so the costs of dealing with an epidemic are actually very high if you don't take strong measures, right? A large number of the population get infected. So that was so back in March and April, that was the kind of the back of the envelope analysis that we were doing around elimination, about whether, you know, is it worth adding another 5 days to level 4 to reduce the chances of us having to have another lockdown to deal with that outbreak. We're doing something at the moment that's more rigorous. So moving away from back of the envelope and really using the models to construct good counterfactual scenarios. And one of the models, which is now quite a sophisticated one, actually can do that regionally and by industry. In quite a sophisticated way. However, it's really taken us until the second outbreak. You know, literally the first time we'd really run that more sophisticated model in anger was with the second outbreak in Auckland. And I have to say that the requests, we probably would have had a more detailed cost benefit analysis out now, but we're dealing with the second outbreak has taken priority over that. So we have got work that's going on at the moment. I mean, I think the sort of live questions are, for me, that I don't yet know the answer to in this space are around, well, what, you know, should we go back to level 1? Given the risk of border arrivals, you know, of a second outbreak, should we be in a level 1.5 long term? If so, what was that 1.5 look like? And what would be the economic consequences of that 1.5 versus going back to 1, you know, getting back to that, you know, economically stronger period we were enjoying in June, July, and some of August, with the risk that would have to go back into a level 3, you know, admittedly a regional level 3. Those sort of things, we've only just built the tools to help us start answering those, and that's where it would have been really useful. I would have really liked to have some off-the-shelf models back in March and April, but the reality is we just hadn't built those for New Zealand. That work hadn't been funded, and so
and that also probably relates to your point around, you know, what sort of data do you need to be able to build those models effectively, and there's kind of, I guess there's a couple of things related to that which are of interest and are also coming up in the question. So one is, you know, we've ended up in probably what we probably all would have predicted at some level, that there'd be at least some form of re-emergence and a need for another lockdown. But if we looked out over the next couple of years, given the kind of quest for a virus to eliminate the virus, we're likely to go through this again. and then the multiple impact of that and how it builds up over time. And the point around, Eamon's made a point around, how do you actually factor in people's tolerance for dealing with these kind of lockdowns and how that change over time. You know, you see some of the images from California where they've obviously got the summer and people on the beaches, and we're about to go into a New Zealand summer, and how we need to take that into account into thinking about the impacts as well.
Yeah, and that's really hard. You know, the understanding how people are going to tolerate lockdowns. I mean, people probably would have seen, you know, some of the mobility, Google mobility or cell phone mobility data that kind of lets you track to a certain extent what's going on. You know, that and it is more than just tolerating lockdown. I mean, I think there's also been, you know, significant shifts in working from home, for example. I mean, and so if people are prepared to keep up working from home medium term, well, that's actually you know, a significant mitigator of risk. The working from home, you know, there's some downsides to it. You know, there's productivity implications, but there are also some important risk mitigations that may come from that. Yeah, and so that's a real difficulty for any of these models, is understanding how people are going to react and respond. I mean, and of course, you know, a lot of it's driven by us watching what's happening overseas, and whether we perceive the risks as that what we see happening overseas is those risks being relevant to us. I mean, I think the fact that we've watched Melbourne sort of lose control of and have to go into a very hard lockdown for a very lengthy period of time, I think was helpful to the narrative in New Zealand with the second lockdown. It probably increased people's tolerance to it. But yeah, it's really hard to know how people are going to, as we watch this pan out. And I think, I mean, you know, the other thing that's happening at the same time is treatments are being developed, right? So, you know, so the implications in terms of how many people might die, the number of hospitalizations we might have, you know, those things are also changing over time. And so at some point, those things are going to come into the conversation alongside, you know, vaccine and vaccine deployment.
I think that the other thing which I'd observe, which is I think quite interesting as well, is while you may see, and we have seen, an overall fall in, say, consumer and retail spending, there's also some interesting distributional impacts. So, you know, how that has maybe flowed away from central city locations to suburbs and to other areas. And, you know, this changing role of what's going to be the role of city centres in the future, and what might that mean to how our economy and what sort of economic diversification looks like. So there's some quite interesting sort of unknowns which relate to behavioural and other changes as well, which are probably hard to take your account into modelling.
Yeah, and of course, really, given my previous work on agglomeration, you know, and diversity, I'm super interested in how that's going to play out, and thinking about that. I mean, I had I took a year of flying in 2018, which is kind of actually a little that was for climate change purposes, which was in some ways turned out to be a little bit of a dry run for lockdown. You know, it wasn't completely the same. I was still traveling around New Zealand, but I was making much greater use of electronic connectivity. And I mean, I had a number of observations out of that. It's allowed me to work with a much wider team of people. So for example, one of the startup companies I'm involved with has people in Auckland, Wellington, and Gisborne, which I don't think would have made sense to me 5 years ago, but actually works really well. And then the flip side is that I've built a more diverse, wider network that actually creates demand for me to travel. So we, you know, I think it is very. I'm not sure how it's going to play out. It's going to be different, and I'm not sure how different it is, and what some of the pros or cons will be. I think there will definitely be some benefits, and definitely be some disadvantages.
Yeah, and then maybe last question for you, Sean, building off one that's also come through from Stacey. So obviously we in New Zealand, I think we, reflect back on the fact that when you look across the globe, people do hold us up as an example, even if we're sometimes critical ourselves of some of the things that might happen. But people generally look back at us and say we're doing pretty well. Now, you know as well as I that there's lots of things that we could do differently and things that other people are doing. And Stacey asked a question about, say, the approach that Taiwan's taken, where they've kept the domestic economy much more sort of open, have all of the sort of social distancing in place, but really quite tight kind of borders. If we're stretching this out over another couple of years before there's a vaccine, what are some of the things that you think others might have done that we can learn from, and that could be applied in a New Zealand where we can kind of can manage ourselves as a team of 5 million?
Yeah, look, I mentioned the app, and obviously that's been a big part of the narrative from quite early on. So that's definitely something we should continue to develop. I mean, I think we want something that's adaptable and that's upgradable. So I'd probably prefer something that's cell phone Bluetooth based, so that we can continue to build on it. As I said, a key thing is integration with the public health service, and in some ways, so that cases can be managed and isolation can be managed. I'd like to see us continue to work on that, and I think that's been part of overseas jurisdictions. It's not the silver bullet, but it's been part of that. I mean, I think, and I'm glad to see that we've the evidence on masking has become much more robust than we didn't understand as much about the disease in March and April. The evidence is now in that masking is actually quite effective, and if we can sort of thinking in terms of comparing ourselves to Asian countries, where for a long time it's been it was very common to see people wearing masks on the street. We probably need to get used to that. Although, ironically, it's most useful indoors, right? So it's not so much about wearing a mask when you're out for your jog. Although I did see someone the other day. It is about when you're in close contact with people. I think if we can adopt that, then that throw in the app. And masking, that gets us to a position where we may be able to avoid level 3 lockdowns, should we have cases come through the border. I mean, a big unknown is whether we can scale up how far we can scale those quarantine facilities. I think those are really difficult facilities to operate. You would have got a hint from that. With that case that was turned up from the Ridges Hotel that caught it in the lift. Those are really difficult facilities to operate and to run safely. So whether we can scale those up, whether we can use improved testing technologies, so we can have more visitors, which is obviously not just important for tourism, but for workforce issues, and for personal reasons, people traveling to see their families and so forth, then I think that's a big question. And I'm really hopeful that we see some new testing technology that helps us with that soon.
Yeah, great. Sean, I'm sure you're really busy. Thank you very much for all of your input today, and it's been great to speak to you again.
Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks. So that brings us to the end of our session for this morning, and we are due back at 1:30, where we'll hear from Pam Ford from ATEED, General Manager of Economic Development, who opened yesterday as the chair of EDNZ, and she's going to be talking about some of the initiatives that have been taken, emerged in Auckland over the last couple of months. So once again, it's been a good morning's conversations. I hope you've enjoyed them, and I look forward to seeing you back here or at 1:30 for our next session. Thanks. Welcome back, everybody. I think everybody who was in the waiting room is now joining us, so it's nice to have you all back again and see so many familiar names. We've got a good session this morning, so hopefully some of you will have seen that. If not, you'll be able to see the videos tomorrow once Susan's uploaded them this evening. And so we've got another three excellent presenters this afternoon, and we're going to start with Pam Ford, General Manager of Economic Development at EDNZ, Chair of EDNZ Board, who opened the Congress yesterday. And Pam's going to start by talking about how Auckland has been responding and some of the key initiatives in the face of COVID. So Pam, I'm going to hand it over to you. I'll turn my camera off. And again, I'll just remind everybody to put your questions through on chat, and I'll try and put a couple of the key ones back to Pam at the end of the session. Thanks, Pam.
Great. Thank you, Patrick. Good to see everybody, and many familiar names on here, including some of my team, so that's really good. Those of you in the AT crowd will recognise a lot of this material. I hope it's not new to you. Let me share my screen, and we'll go from there. So what I want to run through today is really, I think the topic was about what's happening in cities, and number one rule for when you do a presentation or when you write a story is talk about something that you know. And I don't know a hell of a lot, but I know a little bit about Auckland, so that's what I'm going to talk about today, and I hope that's of interest. We're going to cover off just a stock take of the region, the Auckland region, because it is different to the rest of the country. And then what we have done in response, and that's ATED, the Economic Development Agency for the region, some material on recovery, and then I want to finish with an event that we hosted on the 5th of August, and I know some other regions are thinking of doing something similar, and you might get some ideas from that. So the COVID shock in Auckland has been quite severe, and I put that map in there just to remind those who aren't familiar with the region, to give you an idea. It is a very large region, and particularly the urban part of Auckland. Infometrics did a great graph earlier this year where the 12 largest, the next 12 largest cities in New Zealand could all fit within that urban area of Auckland in terms of population. So it is a big region, and it does serve 1 in 3 people of the whole country. And we know that during the first lockdown, 70% of businesses received support under the wage subsidy system, and we had reasonably large numbers seeking job seeker support. During that time as well, Auckland Council delivered 56,000 food and support parcels to over 16,500 or nearly 16,500 homes during lockdown. And it just shows you that divide in Auckland is real. It also goes to, if you're talking to some of the labour force analysts or the unionists, a lot of growing underemployment in New Zealand, in Auckland. So you might have a job, but you might only be being paid 50 or 80%. So we're looking at some really big numbers in terms of unemployment into the future, and certainly border restrictions have a significant impact, and we can come back to those later. So again, just a reminder that the immediate impacts were sharper for Auckland compared to the rest of New Zealand, and particularly in the south of what we call South and West Auckland, which has had some real harsh impacts. City centre as well. So the city centre contributes 19% of Auckland's GDP, and about 15% of all jobs are actually in the CBD. If you take out international education, so no students and no tourists and people working from home, you kind of have a bit of a ghost town, and that's been a huge concern for the retailers and the hospitality sector and the CBD. Again, that reminder that Auckland's priority sectors are listed there, and we'll come back to those. And the fact that Auckland contributes 38% to national GDP is an important contributor to the rest of the country. Again, we're a very diverse city and region, and so those communities have been most at risk. And again, we'll come back to that, particularly Māori and Pacific communities. At ATEED, we work like most or all EDAs. We have a statement of intent that we provide to our shareholder each year saying what we will do. And our current statement of intent focuses on those 4 areas. So investment, since COVID, the importance of local, and so rebuilding the region neighbourhood up. And John Norman, who's on this session this afternoon, is really driving a lot of our work around the build from the neighbourhood up. Showcasing a vibrant and resilient Auckland is a lot about our major events activity, which I won't be talking about today. I'll really just focus on the sector approach and the work that we're doing with businesses. And then importantly, supporting innovation and business. And that last one really has come to the fore and been the rock of our response. So in Auckland, we at ATEED run the Regional Business Partner Program, the government support to SMEs, the vouchers where companies can apply for up to $5,000. And it's been quite amazing, the response, both the government putting in extra money into that pool and then the response from businesses. So to give you an example, that first figure, 5627, that's the number of businesses that registered from March when we went into lockdown 4 through to August. And that's a 5-month period is 5 times the entire 2019 year, so huge. And in total, $9.7 million in vouchers has gone out to mainly 90% of companies having 1 to 19 FTEs. So really getting in at that grassroots level. And I guess from an organisational point of view, we've gone from a team that administers RBP usually, of about 7 to 10 people. We've now got the 55 people working on that program just to get through the backlog and to service the demand. That's the equivalent of about 39 FTEs. So we've had to redeploy people from across the business into the RBP because that's been the most important response that we could provide. So looking into the future, the sectors, and I see E4's on the call, you'd be interested in the sectors that we can cluster activity around. We're looking at digital and technology, particularly technology, and again, that will come up later, construction and infrastructure, screen and creative, and then manufacturing, including food and beverage manufacturing. So I'll just run through a couple of those sectors to give you some high-level information. Digital, it's all about digital. We discovered in lockdown 4, and so that's going to be an area that we are going to up our focus. And more broadly, the tech sector. So this was something that came out of the summit that we held in August. And again, you know, the Auckland region accounts for 54% of the tech sector GDP. So it's an important sector here, and one that we see that if we invest more of our time and resource in, we can create more jobs, more exports, and really become a technology hub around Australasia. And build on the existing precincts that we have. Patrick was very, very involved and pivotal in setting up the Wynyard Quarter Innovation Precinct in Grid AKL. And thanks to all that great work, we're in a really good place in terms of providing a place for entrepreneurs and startups, and it's a great asset for the city. Construction is really important to our region. High proportion of Māori and Pacific are employed in this sector. A retrenchment of employment obviously affects those communities, and again, we'll come to that later. Some of those wonderful stats that Scott, who's also on the call today, keeps us up to date with, you know, all of our information that tells us where we should be putting our effort. And construction is certainly one of those. The shovel-ready infrastructure projects have been important, tapping into some government funding to support city council projects that would otherwise not have been able to stand up, and the ones that have been approved to date, creating about 765 jobs. I'm sure you will have heard about the screen sector in Auckland, maybe through the large films that are produced here. So most recently Mulan, which was released on Friday, that had its production base in Auckland, and most of the filming did take place in Auckland, and also Amazon here being the production base for the television series Lord of the Rings, which will be the biggest TV series ever produced, bigger than Game of Thrones. But we're also home to 80 or over 80%, I think it is, I should know this figure, Scott, of the television production in New Zealand. So we have a solid base of domestic production companies. And the opportunity for New Zealand to be seen internationally as a safe place to conduct screen production, we're hoping will go in our favour. And so around that attraction, making sure that we create some screen skills and talent programs to make sure we've got enough people to work on these productions. Food and beverage, we talked about, huge sector for Auckland, particularly around manufacturing. We've been doing a lot of work in that space over the last year or so. And again, the numbers say it all, and that's why MB is interested in how Auckland adapts to technology shifts such as Industry 4.0. We're also looking at what are the transformation projects in that food and beverage sector that maybe we could fast track, and that could be around plant-based protein production and other forms of beverage, and then obviously using the advances in technology. Again, it's a large employer of Pacifica in Auckland, and we'll come to the impact of technology on manufacturing on Pacifica workforce shortly. So if we move on to recovery in COVID, this is the approach that we took when we were in that first lockdown, and the team were going, right, how are we going to put in place a recovery plan? So they used this model, which was a combination of looking at business support. So fundamentally standing up what we've already got in terms of SMEs, workforce, supply chain, digital and regenerative economy, and enabling the Auckland economy to support our unique Māori identity and inclusion and place-based wellbeing. So one of the other unique characteristics of Auckland is our Pacific population. Quite a different makeup of compared to other cities and towns in New Zealand, in that 15% of Auckland's population are Pacific peoples. We have a very youthful population in Auckland, and so we have a high proportion of young Māori and Pacific people. And by 2050, Pacific people will be about a third of Auckland's working age. So I bring that to your attention today because I do think it's a defining aspect of the Auckland economy that's not often talked about. Again, a high proportion of Pacific people live in South Auckland. What we see is lower skilled workforce and lower average income. So lifting prosperity opportunities for Pacific people in Auckland will be an economic success for us. Again, the sectors, the ones that we're focusing on, feature the community, construction, health, manufacturing and transport. And so one of the successes over the last few months has been working with MB and the Southern Initiative and an organisation called the Cause Collective on the Auckland Pacific Skills Shift program. And so government have provided $22 million over a 4-year period that invests in undertaking innovative approaches to enhancing the Pacific labour market. So what that means is from our end, from EDNZ, what we're going to deliver is a micro-credential course for Pacific workers. And we've started that with some pilot case studies in Sanford's, the fishing company, and we're about to do one out in Henderson, but for level 3 coming down. So that's a really exciting program that will run out over the next 4 years, and it's all about upskilling our people. So that as, for example, manufacturing becomes more technology based, we can ensure that people have the skills to keep working. Another cool program I thought would be an example to show you is the circular economy program.
You cannot start your video because...
that came from a study a few years ago, again started by Patrick, with the Sustainable Business Network, which identified the potential of the circular economy to unlock 8.8 billion in economic value by 2030. So during lockdown, we finished a pilot program with 18 teams where they created projects and used circular solutions within their companies. So that those companies range from Bobucks, which makes baby clothes, through to Fletcher Building or Auckland Transport, so a real range. And we're hoping to roll out that pilot more broadly over the next few years. Taking, the importance of circular is really, really important. Oh, the third and final example that I'll give you about how we approach recovery was using the convening power that all EDAs have in the region. That is one of our most important assets, is how we can bring people together. So we knew that in Auckland, the health crisis was, deteriorating. We knew from research that only 33% of directors knew if they had a plan. The GDP was falling. We were looking at the job seeker stats and the wage subsidy stats. And we did a deep diagnostic piece of work on South and West Auckland and knew that 50,000 people in those two parts of the city were predicted to lose their jobs. So aside from businesses falling over, just this need for social equity and cohesiveness across the region. So rather than me talk about what actually happened, there's a great little video, which I think I'm going to swap to Susan to show now. I think, Susan, shall I stop sharing and you play? Is that the way we're going?
Please, Pam.
Okay, dokie. And I'll be back with you in it's about 4 minutes, so sit back and enjoy. So we had about 200 people attend, and here we go. Now, it's all about facing the challenges that the economy in Auckland has as a result of COVID-19. Today is going to work in 2 ways. One, we're going to hear from 32 speakers, but the other really important part is getting participation from the 200 people in the room. We've got all the brains of Auckland gathered together, and hopefully we'll come up with some amazing ideas. We're going to collate all of that down at the end of the day and present it back to the audience and the rest of Auckland.
We face a crisis with the COVID-19 pandemic, such as none of us have experienced before in our lifetimes. And we need to look at how we manage the threat and how we seize the opportunities that it presents.
I've always believed that Auckland is the magnet for international and domestic migration and growth. And I think you will inevitably see Auckland, a very large city, home to millions of people that want to enjoy what we have here. It may well be an opportunity that's come out of COVID-19 to say, look, can we really get some big infrastructure projects ready and funded in a way that might have been more challenging if we didn't have what is a potentially looming economic crisis for the country.
We have the ability right now to really think about what we want to be known for, so that we can have sectors in the future that better reflect some of the new industries of the world, but also can really position us strongly in terms of innovation, creativity, and around this idea of trust. We want an economy that is just, inclusive, regenerative and circular, and where the prosperity is equitably shared. And whilst we are in the midst of a crisis, it also presents us with an opportunity for a radical transformation and a new economy that enhances the mana of ordinary people and our planet at the same time.
Auckland's got an amazing opportunity to be really brave and to also create a vision for the future around how do we manage a COVID world, how do we take advantage of the fact that New Zealand is now seen as a safe and a sane place to actually come and do business and live.
Our panel today on health and cohesion talked about equity and talked about community. I think the two most important things that did make us survive really well with the COVID.
We have the same problems of social inequality, of congestion, of environmental degradation. All of the issues really for this community are the same as they were before COVID. They've just been put into a bit more of a highlight.
It's a wonderful city centre, so we can create apartment blocks and places for people to live and enjoy as well as work. We can expect an influx of people wanting to live here, and CBD and neighbourhoods can complement each other to create a really cool place to live.
Look at the opportunity that we've got, being able to tap into incredible talent, whether it be engineers, gamers, developers, technical people. They're assisting us with projects here in Aotearoa to really digitalise this nation. Only 1 to 2% of Māori and Pacific are in tech careers. We've got to change that.
And 5 years from now, I would love to see a more cohesive, more connected, more collaborative Taumaki Makaurau. And what that means is recognising the roles of public, of private sector, of small business, of large corporates, all playing a part in contributing, working together for better, equitable outcomes for our communities.
We need to be preparing ourselves for a future that may look different from the past. How can we, with partially closed borders, still make the most of our opportunities and boost our economy and boost our prosperity?
I see this as a time when Auckland can prosper. And I'm actually really, really excited, despite the challenges around us. It's there for us to grab hold of and to seize that opportunity. And we have to move fast. Whatever roadmap we come out of today with needs to be a living document that we continue to evolve.
If Auckland's not the cosmopolitan centre, we don't have one. You know, this is it. We are the only city of international scale in New Zealand, and we have to succeed.
Today is just another step in a very important process of building momentum in terms of where we take the economy, working as Auckland, New Zealand.
Thanks, Susan. So that was the summit, and Rob Fife talked about an ongoing document, and what we've drawn from that summit are 5 kind of areas of actions, and those are areas that we're going to focus on in addition to some of our sector work. 1, investment attraction, and that's foreign direct investment, but also attracting more investment from government. Workforce, very important. Border management, so how can we increase the capacity of managed isolation quarantine? And the 4th one being domestic promotion. And finally, public funding. How do we tap into some growth funds that will stand up some work? So that's what I have. My final slide, which I don't need to go back to, but is similar to what I said yesterday. And it's what we all need right now is kia kaha, kia maya, kia manawa nui. Be strong, be brave, be steadfast. We will get through this. And on that note, I'll swap back to Patrick and look forward to any questions.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Pam. Great video and slides as always. So really interesting to hear about some of those initiatives. We've got a couple of minutes before the next one, so I'll ask you a couple of questions, see if any come through. So one of the things that we've obviously been talking about over the last couple of days is the need for economies to diversify in the face of kind of COVID, and to be able to both build back better and be stronger for the future. And in Auckland, the scenario is probably slightly different. So we've actually got a very diversified economy already. But one of the, I think, the issues that's interesting, which you touched upon, is if we think about Auckland as the polycentric city and how different parts of the city have different characteristics and can thrive in different ways. And we're already seeing some of the concerns about what the future of the CBD looks like, but also other bits of the city that are perhaps benefiting from more of us working from home, etc. What does that mean for AT? What does that mean for the future of the CBD in a different type of model where the economy is more diversified and polycentric?
Well, that's a good question, Patrick. You'd be able to answer this probably even better than I, but I'll give it a go. This is what we've been thinking about. Two parts, really. That whole building from the neighbourhood up, so more dispersed workers. So what does that mean? It means good things for local neighbourhoods. And John Norman, who I think's on this, and certainly Jonathan is, who is in John's team, are doing a lot of work around how we have a hyper-local strategy, and also another program, Flexi City. So how does a city orient itself to attract more people into the CBD at different times? How do you activate? We're looking at building a nighttime economy in Auckland, which is not a new thing offshore. As you all know, when we go offshore, there's stuff happening in the city centre, there's shops open. So talking to the heart of the city, the business association, about how we reactivate the city in different ways. Another interesting aspect to the city is office space being vacated. So how do we attract maybe other multinationals to either expand or to bring some of their businesses here for 12, 18 months if they're having trouble standing up in other parts of the world. So there's a whole lot of, I guess, tactics to put in place for CBD. Long term, I think the CBD will come back, and Auckland is lucky in that the City Rail Link in the next few years will be up and running. That's a huge asset. The International Convention Centre will be ready around 2024, bringing business events back in. And even at the end of this year and early into next year with America's Cup and all of the waterfront changes opening up, we think that will be an attractor, and it should be a really great attractor for domestic tourists to come and see Auckland and be able to get around the city a lot easier. So that's that part, and then that other part is how you drive your hyper-local and really build up some of those local areas. And I can see it, I'm sure you can see it on the shore, more people around Milford. I live in Avondale. There's a co-working space there that's popped up. It's going to be really interesting how this all shifts, isn't it, over the next few years?
Definitely. And then the other thing that I was going to ask, which I'm sure you've got some good sort of views on as well, is like Auckland, New Zealand and Auckland's global visibility has probably been greater than ever before, given the impact of kind of COVID as well. And there's obviously an awful lot that we've been talking about in terms of returning Kiwis, the experience, the sort of brain gain side of it. And Auckland is also can help as a gateway to the rest of the country for all visitors. So what's your perspective on how we all need to kind of best capture the talent and experience that's going to be coming back or attracted back to New Zealand?
Yeah, I think that's one of the bonuses, isn't it, of COVID, that we are having a brain gain to some extent. Kia, Kiwi expats abroad, share office with us here in AT, and they're running a campaign and trying to capture, information about the people that are coming back, so that that can be shared around others. And I think it's again goes back to that. I think Kirsten Tawau said about being connected and cohesive and collaborative. So I think it's really exciting that a lot of Kiwis are choosing to come back. If any of it, I mean, all of us have probably been overseas and then come back to New Zealand with great skills and wondered how on earth we're going to fit in and get jobs. So that will be interesting around the job matching, but also maybe that will give rise to a new wave of entrepreneurialism. you're seeing, I'm going a bit off piste here, but the unemployment figures showed a high proportion of females being laid off work. You know, how do we encourage women into entrepreneurship? How do we encourage them, the people coming back with their new skills and their connections offshore to stand up new exciting businesses of the future?
Great. Pam, thank you very much. And it's been great to hear from you again. And I'm sure we'll be hearing before you again before the end of the conference.
Thank you. And thank you everybody for tuning in. See you next time. See ya.
Right. Great, so a couple more sessions left this afternoon, and next it's my pleasure to introduce Jane Russell, who's the Group General Manager for Employment Services at MSD. I'm pretty sure that Jane's here because I think I saw her pop up on the call just now, and Jane's going to talk about jobs, 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 obviously an issue for all of us. So Jane, if you are there, there we go. I'll encourage you to turn your sound on as well, and I'll hand over to you for your presentation. Thank you, Jane.
Kia ora, everybody. So ina mana, ina reo, ina karatanga maha, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you, Patrick, for that kind introduction. I'm Jane Russell, and I'm the Group GM for Employment at MSD. Thank you, Susan, for the opportunity to talk. And I thought I'd start off by just sharing a bit of MSD's kind of employment response to COVID, focusing a bit about what we've done, what we're working on, and a bit about where we're heading. So I'm going to do my very best to try and share my screen and hope that this works. And that's not looking great to begin with. So if you could just bear with me for a minute while I try and get up a presentation. Okay, that is not the screen you want to see, so I will stop that one.
Jane, would you like me to put it up for you?
Yeah, I'm having, thank you. For some reason I was working fine before and now it doesn't want to work.
Okay, just one moment.
Wonderful, thank you, Susan. Okay, so we've got a few slides, but it's more a bit of detail really, and I'll try and click through them pretty quickly. So I want to start, Susan, are you going to have to drive this? Sorry, aren't you?
That's all right.
Okay. So I think it would be fair to say since COVID, MSD's been pretty busy, and we've played a significant role in the response, including, I think one of the biggest contributions we've made is through the wage subsidy and leave support schemes, paying out almost $14 billion through these schemes to more than 650,000 businesses, which was covered more than 2.5 million employees over individual applications. So, you know, that was a big effort from MSD. We stood the very first wage subsidy up in 2 days. And, you know, various iterations as, you know, we've been through the wage subsidy extension, the leave scheme, and again, the wage subsidy resurgence over, in the last couple of weeks. So a lot of effort shifting into wage subsidy support from MSD. If you think about that, we've also had an increasing amount of benefit applications. Sorry, Susan, I'm clicking on to the next slide. So within the month of going live with our subsidy, we'd also granted over 30,000 benefit applications, and that's more than double the normal level of activity for that time of year. So even though the wage subsidy was doing a job in retaining employment for people, there was a lot of people coming through the benefit system for that time of year as well. And there's now more people receiving benefit support than during the GFC. So the numbers of clients receiving benefits crossed the 350,000 mark for the first time since the global financial crisis, and it's expected to reach almost 400,000 clients. Since lockdown, we've had to shift our business to virtual and phone, and so that's quite a shift for MSD. you respond really differently when your doors are closed. And so, you know, we've been processing more than 400,000 applications for emergency grants based on the same time as the previous year. And we've had to respond quickly to manage our operating level and ensure that we're operating safely under all COVID-19 alert levels. So I guess it's just a sense of trying to share the volume of work that we have been delivering. So wage subsidy, you know, happened really fast, and we had to pivot the business to ensure that we could process those applications appropriately while still trying to support many individuals who were losing their jobs. And so that's kind of the immediate response to the kind of benefit system and to wage subsidies. And if we move on to the next slide, and the next one again, we've been under a bit of an umbrella, a kind of hashtag Keep New Zealand Working. And one of the first things we did once our minister released this kind of hashtag approach was to stand up a work and income online recruitment tool. As I said before, your business has to pivot pretty quickly. Most of our employment services, if we could just skip on to the next slide, thanks Susan. Most of our employment services to date have been delivered face-to-face, and we've had very little digital engagement with both business and clients really. Lots of ways to apply for benefit online, but not so many ways to engage through MSD's employment services. And what we learnt really quickly on during lockdown was that essential services continued to recruit. And to be fair, we were one of them, having a significant investment in case management support very early on in one of the COVID budget responses. So to support this, we established a new digital platform where employers and potential employees could connect quickly around employment opportunities. And to date, it's been really interesting and been quite successful. So we've registered over 27,000 job seekers. And when I say job seekers, I don't mean clients. This service is available to any employer and to anybody interested in connecting to any type of a work that might be advertised on the platform. And we've had over 4,000 employers looking for staff. And so it really is just we started it up under the kind of banner of jobs during COVID, because we were getting lots of engagement from employers who wanted to find workers. And with most people's doors shut, that wasn't necessarily an easy experience for them. So as I said, it's really important to note it's not a platform for MSD's clients. It's a platform for any job seeker trying to engage with an employer. We started out really quickly in 2 weeks, and on the next slide you'll see an example of us. We've continued to refine the website to make it much easier and simpler for job seekers and employers, and we're getting really good feedback that the system is working well now. So it was a bit kind of busy and a bit cluttered at the start, but now starting to get really good feedback from employers about how easy it is to use and how they are finding suitable candidates on the website. So that's proving to be effective, and we'll keep building and getting feedback. The next thing I just wanted to talk a little bit about the significant investment across government and redeployment and job creation schemes, and really just focusing on MSD's role in this. So, you know, the kind of redeployment response from MSD started way back in the Tairāwhiti region when the logs started, forestry logs started sitting on the decks at the ports and not moving. And what you saw happen in a really small community of Tairāwhiti was that the labour market got affected incredibly quickly. And so you had lots of people looking for redeployment opportunities. So the first kind of government response to that was a redeployment package up there. And you've seen small niche kind of ones like that right through to big programs such as Jobs for Nature, which is delivered through all our environmental agencies. And while that's not my program to talk about, I just want to talk a little bit about MSD's role in supporting this wide range of redeployment opportunities. And our role is making sure that we are providing the training and skills that people need to take up these redeployment opportunities and job creation schemes, as well as because of our wide-ranging kind of and diverse ability across New Zealand, because we're on the ground everywhere, being a vital link between agencies, providers and job seekers through our labour market team. So we're playing a really strong connecting role out there. Thank you. So the next one I just want to move on to is a little bit about our response to apprenticeships. So if any of you were in this kind of sector during the GFC, you will know how vulnerable apprentices are to labour market shocks. And so we've responded by doing a few things. I'll talk about two that MSD are leading out. So Mana and Mahi is a program that we've been delivering for a couple of years now. And to date, it's been a really effective program, almost placing nearly 1,000 young people into work. But what we realised is that employers are going to be a little bit more risk averse about hiring someone who's got a long-term kind of commitment to that business. And so Mana and Mahi has been expanded. It used to be 1 year worth of support, now heading out to 2 years worth of support. The wage subsidy has increased to a first year of $16,000 and a second year for $8,000. And the main component about why the wage subsidy has been increased is to support vulnerable people to connect and stay and work. And the other bit is the connection to training and like kind of that lifelong development while in a role. So you only can stay in Mana and Mahi as long as the person you're supporting retains and maintains a training connection. And we've also increased the supports to young people and other people that might want to come into the program. And I think the other expanded eligibility is about who Mana and Mahi can take it up. So it used to be focused as a youth apprenticeship program. Expanded eligibility means anybody can apply if they have a vulnerability in the labour market, and that includes people at risk of displacement. So quite a change in the types of people that MSD are supporting. And the second apprenticeship program, if we could just whip to the next slide, Susan, called Apprenticeship Boost. So we're delivering this on behalf of Ministry of Education. So this will support employers to retain apprenticeships as their economy recovers its impacts from COVID. So this is available to employers with apprentices in their first 2 years of study while they're training and developing their skills. And the people assure me it's paid by MSD, but I'm sure about, but through a simple online application. So it's not a complex way to register sign up your business and to let us know about your apprentices. We do a couple of checks with IR and TEC around verification, and then that's a monthly payment as long as your apprentices are in the first couple of years of study. And so the goal of programs such as this and some of the other programs delivered out of MB is to do our very best to try and retain that industry connection for these people. Moving on, hopefully I'm not going through these too quickly. The other thing we noticed is that in response to COVID, there's been a whole lot of new central government agencies get employment sort of funding, whether it be through some of the apprenticeship programs that I've just talked about, or where it be it through a large range of new job creation schemes or redeployment schemes and changes to existing funds and services. And we got some feedback pretty quickly on that for people, this was actually a bit confusing. It was quite hard to navigate across this range of new products and services. And so in early August, we stood up a new kind of website called connected.govt. And so basically it's got three components. It's got a website, an 0800 number if the website's not simple enough to help. And we've also done some work about connecting 35 MSD service centres and 3 MB job hubs around the Connected brand. And that's to make sure that people, either through the website, on the phone, or even in face-to-face, if you walked into one of these 35 centres or one of the MB Skills and Jobs hubs, they would be able to help you navigate through some of these new programs. And some of the, there's lots of money out there in redeployment and job creation, and trying to make that simpler for people to connect to. So there's kind of 3 things you can do on there. You can find staff, you can find support for business, or you can find a job. And really, even though we've had 100,000 views to some of the pages over the last kind of month, most people's interest is honing in around find a job. And I think that's a sign of, there's lots of people recently displaced in the labour market and people wanting to return back to work as soon as they can. And so hopefully this is one way people can find and connect. And the last one, just trying to show in some of these sites, it's got a bit of a different look and feel for employers and partner agencies and for individuals to come and engage around these 35 MSD employment centres and the MB hubs. So connected in 3 different ways, and we're going to continue to try and improve the service. So Connected stood up pretty quickly, like everything else during COVID. And while it started as hopefully what people are finding is a useful place to go and find support, we'll keep trying to make it easier to keep helping people get connected to the jobs and services that they need. And so that kind of covers our mainly our kind of original response through wage, some of the things we've done around trying to, I guess, connect it and enable people to find the opportunities. But MSD's got more work to do to support jobs and to support people connecting back to the labour market. And so I just thought I'd finish by sharing 3 or 4 of those things with you. So we'd already started to expand our employment services to a wider group of New Zealanders, so making sure that, you know, there was an effective employment offering for people who weren't on benefit as well as those that were. COVID impacted how fast that was kind of coming together, and it kind of made us pivot really, because what we learned really quickly, as I said earlier, is when your doors are shut, you've got to do your business a bit differently. And we had a whole lot of new clients who wanted really short, sharp interventions from us rather than like long-term kind of case management. They wanted to access the services they need as fast as they could to get them bounced back out into the labour market. And so we introduced a new service called Rapid Return to Work. And it's a phone-based service for anyone that comes through the benefit system through My MSD, which is our digital application process. And if you indicate on that you're ready to work now and you want support, you'll have an employment case manager kind of phone you the next day. And that's really around trying to make sure that we are fronting up really early on to people's kind of, you know, displacement and entry into the benefit system, if that's the way they come through, and making sure that we are providing that immediate support to help them return to work. It's early days, but it's, you know, people are selecting the service and people are using the products and the expertise of the employment services case managers on there. And, you know, it's got an over 33% return to work number, which we're really proud of, and people are really enjoying that they can access the services so quickly. So that's one of the things we stood up, and because it's working so well, we are about to expand that with another 25 staff coming on board to support people in their return to work. And if you anybody likes to look on Gets and see what sort of services people are procuring at the moment, what we have heard from a lot of returning beneficiaries and for people new to the benefit system is that they're after different kinds of services. They're after really short, sharp intervention services around CVs and career counselling and you know, how to job interviews. And so we're looking to procure a range of services to support this new group, and that will all be delivered through the Rapid Return to Work service. The other thing we heard really early on in COVID was employers needed us to be more flexible with our products and services. You know, from developing ways to support many of the short-term shovel-ready projects out there. Some of these projects only, you know, last a short period of time, from 4 to 6 weeks. Some go for longer. But you've got really willing and active people taking on short-term work and wanting to connect to a more sustainable job at the end of that. And so we've had to kind of pivot some of our products and services to make sure that we're meeting the needs of employers and job seekers in the COVID environment. And that includes, as I said earlier, making sure our products can support a wider range of people, not just people on benefit. The other thing we've started to build is what we're calling virtual job expos. So basically, we've been running job expos in our service centres for a really long time, where employers and providers come in and connect. When your doors are shut, that's not necessarily possible. But what we have created is a way, and we're building it right now, for job seekers and employers to be able to connect virtually. And this could be around a particular industry or a particular type of job that was going. It really depends how you want to use it. But we thought we should kind of put our money where our mouth is, and we plan to pilot this with MSD vacancies. We've had a significant investment from government in MSD roles, and we thought that we could try a virtual job fair for anybody that might be interested in working at MSD. And so you'll be able to come into this kind of virtual experience and to talk with people who work in particular roles. You know, we would imagine we might have our CE, you know, on a virtual auditorium talking generally about what it's like to work at MSD, and just trying to test a different way of connecting people to employment. So like I said, we'll pilot that with us. And while we're doing that and making sure that the platform works and people enjoy the experience, we are out testing with employers and job seekers. And to date, we've had really great feedback that employers and people see this type of environment as a really way that would suit their needs, not even just because of COVID, but even going forward. So we will continue to do that. So that's another thing. And the last thing I just wanted to kind of touch on is when you have a volume of new clients coming through your benefit system, it starts off as busy in the benefit application space, but it quickly turns into increased demand for your employment services. And what we're trying to do through this kind of click to enroll services that I talked about, we're procuring a range of new services for. We want to be able to put this up into a self-service option. So you could imagine if you were at risk of displacement, or you were worried about what was going on, or you thought you might need a new CV because you were a bit concerned about what was happening in your industry, anyone will be able to come and register through MyMSD as a job seeker. And we will have a range of services that clients are telling us, or people telling us that they need access to. And we'll make that available through a self-service option through MyMSD. So we're procuring those services now. We're building the capability for people to access services in the digital space for employment. And that should help manage those that want to just connect with MSD in a different way that doesn't involve walking through our door. Or having to get on the phone to talk to us, that there'll be a digital way and then that people will be able to kind of tailor their own experience and self-serve the things that they need from government. So that's a really kind of, I guess, rush synopsis of some of the things we're doing in the employment space. I'm more than happy to take questions, but really wanted to, again, Susan, thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Thanks very much, Jane. That was really helpful to kind of go through all of that detail, some of the things that you're doing. And there's a few questions coming through that we've got time to discuss. So the first one sort of picks up the point that, as you said, you've got probably some quite significant changes around the profile of some of the job seekers. And that's probably even before we get into one of the conversations from an earlier session about returning Kiwis who may also be looking for employment. So perhaps a very different kind of cohort of either clients or customers that could benefit from some of the services. And I guess there's a few questions that come off of that. And the sort of first one is, through the platforms that you have, and is it possible to get data at the level of individual territorial authorities that gives us a better understanding of the characteristics of some of these job seekers and the skill sets that they might have and the types of experience that they've got, so that we'd be able to ascertain whether they were workers that were displaced specifically because of COVID, what they were looking for, were they returning residents and citizens of the country?
Couple of things there. So the kind of working income online recruitment tool I referred to is basically just a tool out in the market. So we're not monitoring like that. You would expect probably government to monitor. So limited information that we could glean from that. It's really just a place for employers and clients to come together in the market. Certainly from MSD's own data, we have a wealth of access to some of those things that you are referring to. So I think it would just depends on where you want the information to source from. But definitely, we can tell when people have entered the benefit system, what types of work they're looking for. There's certainly a range of things that we could, provide information to people if that was helpful.
And so that would be about individual sort of local authorities or EDAs kind of working with your local offices around the programs, etc.
Or even with us through the central national office. I know our regions don't always align up to TLAs, and there's a bit of complexity around that, but we can get as close as we can to trying to do some mapping if that information is critical to the EDAs.
Right. And you obviously also talked about, with that changing profile, that it has implications for the types of services that you would be offering. And that's what the current recruitment exercise is around, the current GETS exercise, procuring new sort of services.
Yeah, so the regions respond, at their regional level in many different ways. This is more of a what we've learned out of sending out the rapid return to work service. So what we're hearing from the case managers that are talking, every day with hundreds of clients across the country is that they don't need lots of skills and training. They don't need long kind of development courses. They don't need that kind of big kind of counselling, case management function. What they need is sometimes some short, some sort of peer mentoring, some kind of, you know, if the industry's particularly been effective about what do I do with my transferable skills, how far am I away for applying for jobs and other you know, other similar type jobs, lots of CVs. I think it's incredible. I mean, you know, unless you've applied for a job recently, why do you have a CV, right? But huge volumes of people who have never had to have one. And these are people who have, you know, been in the labour market and really looking for support to get CVs and job interview skills. Many people, you know, connected to the labour market have never been through a formal process. And so why we often have those types of skills and development opportunities as part of bigger courses, we don't necessarily have them easily procured as individual, and we don't necessarily have them available digitally. So the kind of new kind of RFP is to try and get them as individual components as opposed to a package of courses for people.
Yeah, makes sense. And then one of the other themes that's sort of coming through, and you mentioned the sort of jobs expos, and I think quite a few regions and EDAs have experience of working with MSD and other partners around these kind of physical job fairs. And obviously in a digital world, which we're increasingly having to be able to inhabit, much like today, the extent to which some of your tools and online tools and services might be able to be adapted by individual employers or by EDAs that were looking at running virtual job fairs with industry in their area. Is that something that MSD is also sort of open to partnering with others on?
Oh, absolutely. So, you know, we're pretty close to finishing the platform build. If people want to use it and are comfortable with how it works and its settings, we would be absolutely up for partnering with people. I mean, you know, once you build a platform, it's repeatable, and so we think we should still test it out with ourselves to make sure it works. But we're really excited about how the virtual job fairs, you know, can work and how they can connect. And we think even potentially it could move through to just, I was thinking just the other day about like limited service volunteers, and potentially how do you show people what it's like to be on the Burnham course for, you know, it just creates so many different ways for you to engage with current participants. And for many rural people, you know, access to, you know, recruitment services and things can be quite the effort. And so we're really excited about the potential of the virtual job fairs, and we would absolutely be happy to work with others who might want to use the platform once it's up and out.
That's good. You may get a few people approach you about that, given some of the questions. And then a couple of other things for me. So one of them, obviously, the full impact of COVID in terms of when the wage subsidies work through, and we've seen a period of adjustment. I think we're all anticipating that there'll be further changes to the labour market that will come. To what extent does the use of sort of more active labour market policies come into your sort of current kind of planning horizon in terms of actually getting people attached and remaining attached to the labour market?
So lots of work through the Education, Employment and Training Ministers group. A group that MSD is, you know, one member of, and so there's lots of work in our employment policy team. So I lead more of the operational kind of delivery, but lots of work about making sure, even across, and particularly across government, under this connected kind of concept about how labour market policies all support each other, and are we investing in the right, you know, cohorts. Previous speaker Spam referred to how females have been, you know, significantly impacted by COVID, and so are we investing enough in the right types of roles and other, you know, active labour market policies adjusting as the labour market adjusts and comes out of wage subsidy. So I think there's a lot still to do, but it's really important that we are responsive, I think, is the most important thing government can do, particularly MSD right now.
That's great. Jane, just looking back through to see if it doesn't look as though we've got any further questions right now. So, but I'm sure there'll be a few people that will want to follow up as well. So thank you all very much for your time and your input this afternoon, but also for all of the hard work that you and your team are doing at the moment.
Lovely. Thank you for the opportunity. Have a great day.
Thanks. Great. Okay, so we now have our next speaker, Todd McClay, isn't scheduled until 3 o'clock. And we think he's planning to join us about 2:45. So we've got a little bit of time. So what I'm going to suggest is, it feels like just about afternoon tea time. I'm going to suggest that if you want to keep yourselves on mute or log off and log back on for a 3 o'clock kind of start, and we'll give the minister enough time to member of parliament enough time to turn up, and then we can get going again with that last session for today, as we're a little bit ahead of schedule. So to be safe, let's say if you can aim to join us again at 2:50. And then if we are able to start a little earlier, we will. If not, we'll start at the advertised time of 3 o'clock. So thank you all. Hope you enjoyed the last couple of conversations, and hope to see you back again in about 20 minutes. Thanks. To get started for our last session of day 2. I hope you all had enough time to grab a cup of tea. I have finished my banana bread, so I'm all ready to go. In this last session of the day, it's my pleasure to introduce the Honourable Todd McClay. Todd's the Member of Parliament for Rotorua and the Opposition Spokesman for Economic Development, so it's going to be really interesting to hear Todd's perspective and his policies. He's served in Parliament since 2008 and has held the following offices: Minister of Trade, Health, Tourism and Foreign Affairs, Chair of Finance, Expenditure and Commerce Select Committees, as well as many other roles that I'm sure have provided a good platform for his current role as opposition spokesman. Todd, thank you very much for finding the time to join us today, and we look forward to hearing from you, as well as the keen interest that we have in your all those planes on your shelves behind you. Welcome.
Well, look, thank you very much, and everybody, good afternoon. I'm assuming people are in their workplaces and some perhaps in their homes. I'm in Wellington. I've been out travelling today and stopped off between a flight home back to Rotorua for some campaigning. I thought it was easy to come in here. So you're right, there are a number of aeroplanes sitting behind me, and I wonder whether that's not the case all over New Zealand and all over the world. It's been an unprecedented year, and you know, I think that every election that I've been involved in, this is my 5th, I've been saying this is the most important election that New Zealand has faced. And I think this year I actually mean it, because it is quite significant, the challenges we face and the decision that New Zealanders will make, which will set us on a course back to you know, jobs and a growing economy and businesses that can be self-sufficient and stand alone, and the ability to use sensibly and responsibly the resources that we have at our disposal and get on top of debt. Or the alternative is none of those things and spiraling debt. That means our children, our grandchildren are going to be burdened for many years to come. You know, it's interesting as we all sit here, think about the situation we have in New Zealand after lockdown, where there was quite some celebration. And I think New Zealanders deserved the right to celebrate because they did what they were asked. They sacrificed, they stayed at home. With very few exceptions, they took on the spirit of what was being asked for them. And subsequently, we find that we face restriction again. You know, it's quite challenging that in Auckland they've had, you know, level 3 and now level 2.5, whatever that means. You know, I'm disappointed that this virus has come up again. I see there are 6 new cases announced today, 4 of which are community transmission. And if I had a quick look, if I recollect, they're linked to the clusters that we have seen, very, very large clusters in Auckland. What's most disappointing about that is that the virus was able to get some form of foothold again, and it did so through getting over the border. I'm deeply disappointed that the government hasn't been able to find out exactly how it got back in. And the reason for that is not political. It's purely that if we don't know how it got back in, it could happen again. If that hole in the fence of the border is not plugged, it can happen again. And what we've seen over the last few weeks is every day in Auckland, about 400 to 450 people have lost their jobs because of the restrictions placed upon them and the economy. And New Zealand just can't afford, you know, longer periods of economic restriction. And we can't afford to continue to yo-yo in and out of lockdown and restriction because every time that happens, it creates uncertainty. And every time that happens, the government must borrow and spend more money. And every time that happens, there are hardworking New Zealanders that lose their job through no fault of their own, and people lose their businesses. And these are businesses actually that often are propped up with their life savings, with their homes. They've secured, funds against their homes, their houses, and a very challenging situation. I thought I might just set the scene a little bit of where we are statistically, and then we have an opportunity to consider some of the things that need to be done now and should have been done anyway, and then need to be done post-COVID, whatever post-COVID means. And I think it's going to be an ongoing discussion. And I'm just going to run through these in no particular order. This has been the biggest economic contraction in 160 years, according to the Reserve Bank. There's almost 11,000 mortgages in arrears, according to the Reserve Bank. And it was interesting some weeks ago, a newspaper article saying that people, particularly in Auckland, were selling their homes now before they knew they might be forced to, because they were concerned about, what would happen to the job market, the economy, and what was going to happen to them and their businesses. 350,000 jobs currently being supported by the wage subsidies, and that's coming off in the coming weeks. Almost $15 billion paid out in wage subsidies so far. 80,000 extra people on the government unemployment benefits since March, and just 5,000 alone last week, then when the statistics came out, have joined the dole in that week alone. GDP is expected to fall by around 14% in the second quarter compared to 7% in Australia. And I note that there are a number of different commentators and economists and so on out with varying figures. Rather than a discussion or debate about just how bad it's going to be, I think we can accept that there is going to be significant reductions in GDP. And with that, the consequence of less government revenue, more borrowing, but of course, challenges for the wider economy and businesses. Government debt forecast to grow to 54% of GDP. The government said they're going to borrow $150 billion over the next 4 years, 3 or 4 years, taking us to about $200 billion debt levels by percentage not seen for many people on this Zoom call today since around the time of the last war. And the Reserve Bank has already purchased $30 billion in government debt by printing money. If we jump back to the beginning of the year, and I think of the narrative then of the things that we were saying in opposition should have been done and needed to be done and what would happen to the economy, well, the doom and gloom is much, much more significant now than it was then. And so where to from here, and what's the plan? I've got to say that, with the Parliament being called back and, for an extra 3 weeks, when it comes to the election and policy, it's not clear to me that the public has been focused on the election to the degree that we might want them to. Equally, at the same time, we've not been campaigning as widely just yet. It feels like that's starting, and I predict a very, very intense 3 or 4 weeks of campaigning. And it's very important that we have policy out, not just around COVID-19, but as we move forward into the future. And just to give you an example of that, you would have seen the 2 major parties make announcements yesterday, the first of which was around methamphetamine from Judith Collins, and the Prime Minister, who was in my home patch of Rotorua, announcing a public holiday. And the reason I mention that is actually I'm supportive of Matariki becoming a holiday. I have no issue at all with that. But my concern, probably from an economic development point of view or a business point of view, and particularly small business, is the way that that's been promoted or billed as a solution to the challenges faced by the tourism industry, and that there is no cost or implication no significant implication to an additional holiday upon businesses, and that it would start in 2 years' time. Well, what we need is a real plan. What businesses need is actually detailed plans and policies today. Those 5,000 people that lost their jobs last week actually would be hoping for policies, detailed policy that will help create jobs for them today, and they probably want to work, not a holiday in 2 years' time. So this isn't about Matariki. I think if we want to celebrate culture and our history and our heritage, then that's a very, very good thing. but the implication for business at a time when not only have they had great cost imposed upon them over the last 2 years through additional regulation and tightening of, things in the workforce and so on, the implication for them of a signal that says that, there will be more time off and more cost for you, I think on top of the, the significance of COVID, is something that will be challenging for so very many of them. When it comes to economic development, National has a very, very simple view of this. National makes it easier for business to do business, and what that means is create jobs. I mentioned earlier the government's going to borrow $150 billion over the next 3 or 4 years to spend, and I'll come to that in a moment because it's going to be a very important part of how we, steward New Zealand back towards degrees of prosperity. But actually what we need is a strong economy with strong businesses to grow the economy, so governments have greater revenue through a growing economy and turnover, and that New Zealanders do better, create those jobs. We want to create an environment where it's easier for business to operate, not have extra red tape and regulation. And a number of the areas that I think we need to focus on is around making workplace relations easier. How do we create a system or roll out changes or undo some of the harm that I think has been done in this area so that good employers get on and create responsible and constructive relationships with their employees, and we focus on those who are not good employers as opposed to burdening everybody with costs. In health and safety, how can we make sure that our workplaces are safe without just having more and more rules? Because actually more rules in themselves don't make people safer in the workplace. How can we reduce regulation, the RMA, find ways to work better with local government and actually unburden local government, because successful governments, including us over the 9 years under John Key and Bill English, have created rules that I think in many cases have made it harder for local government to do things that we need them to, that help businesses grow and help regional economies grow, good economic development. But at the same time, there will be councils that actually have taken it further than many would want them to. The Building Act, I think, is an example of that. We've set out a number of areas that we think are important for the economy, and I'm going to run through these fairly quickly. The first is responsible economic management, delivering infrastructure, reskilling and retraining our workforce, a greener, smarter future, and building stronger communities. And these 5 points are all interlinked around the economy, and they are the centerpiece when it comes to good economic development. So it's very simple on the first one of responsible economic management. Look, whomsoever forms the government is going to have to borrow money. I think most countries, if not every country in the world, will be doing that. But the challenge is not the borrowing, it's the amount and what it's spent on. Think of this in the case of your own business. You have decided the best way to get back on your feet post-COVID is to go along to the bank and borrow a bit of money and buy a van to be able to deliver things. And that you can reach out to a wider consumer or customer base. If there is more restriction that comes, you may well be able to continue to trade, whereas previously you haven't. But at the same time, as the bank gives you that money, you decide to go and buy a sports car, and it's a nice to have. It's not necessarily going to do what you need in your business. And after a few weeks of driving around in the car, you realise that actually you did need the van after all. You go back to the bank, and the bank says, well, you bought a sports car, we're not lending you any money. Problem you have with a government that borrows money is they will always be able to get more, either through more custom, which is taxation, or through borrowing in itself. And so what New Zealanders will need in the coming years when it comes to the economy is a government that's borrowing responsibly and carefully and spending on things that will be good in the short, medium and long term for the economy and for New Zealanders. We've been very clear that there are a number of things we will want to do, is invest in core public services every year to invest more. New Zealanders deserve that, and they need that at the same time. To create rules and regulations and an environment where the private sector can create jobs. To reduce tax burden, and there are a number of ways and areas that we want to do that. And when it comes to investing in core public services, the reason we need to get this model around debt right is, in the end, for a country that has very high levels of debt, there are only 2 ways or 3 ways that you get to moderate that, or to live with it or pay it back. The first is our fewer public services. Our doctors, our nurses, our teachers, our policemen and others end up getting less or not as much as they should because the government has fewer choices based on the money that we spent in the coming years, and it will need to be paid back. The second is to tax more. It is my submission that under a Labor government, we've seen that on many occasions. And the thing about taxation is you should only tax the amount that you need. It is your money, it's not the government's money. People work very, very hard for it, and therefore we need to ensure that we spend it carefully and responsibly. And I don't think that has been the case for much of this last 3 years of the Labor Green New Zealand First government. And the third is to grow the economy, to reduce burden upon business, to allow them to find ways to be more productive and more competitive. And with a growing economy, the government is able to claim more through the tax system and has so very many more choices. So in a couple of these areas, I want to talk a little bit more. So when it comes to taxation and increasing the tax burden, we've said we want to index the tax rate so that as we enter the period where we will have inflation again, the wages or what New Zealanders earn are not diminished as they move through a tax bracket. And we've said we would want to do this every 3 years, so future governments could plan. We would legislate for that very quickly. That will make a real difference and a direct difference to New Zealanders when they are working so very hard. The second is a number of areas to make it easier for business and industry to invest. We've said we want to look at what a number of other countries around the world have done and make it easier for businesses to invest in the plant and machinery we need them to. We'll allow them to write off business investment of up to $150,000 as a one-off in that tax a year, as opposed to having to spread that out over a period of time. And then to continue to make sure that the tax system is responsive and that it's responsible and that it is delivering for all New Zealanders. In the area of infrastructure, it's very clear, and we have some real opportunities here. Under the John Key Billingsley government, we decided infrastructure was a priority, both roading and rail, the investment in Kiwi Rail and other types of infrastructure. So many New Zealanders during lockdown had the opportunity to have ultra-fast broadband delivered directly to their home. Something was delivered, was put in place under our last government. All those watching Netflix would be pleased about that, but the investment was not actually so that my kids can play games online more easily, or we can all watch Netflix online. It was so that we could have a modern economy that was growing and would be as good, if not better, as many other parts of the world. So as far as infrastructure is concerned, we've announced that we want to invest $31 billion in addition to what the current government is planning in a number of areas for infrastructure. So I mentioned earlier, every year, investment in public service infrastructure, schools and hospitals will increase. But at the same time, we've been looking at announcements around transportation infrastructure. New Zealand needs the roads to get our goods and services to the port more efficiently and more effectively, and we have a real opportunity as a result of
not bad. Not bad. I'm just in the middle of some Zoom meeting. What's up?
Somebody's got their
Can you make sure you've got yourself on mute so that Todd can continue his presentation? Thanks.
We should have kept quiet and listened to what was going on there. That might have been more interesting than my little talk. Hey, look, thanks very much. I'll continue. So when it comes to infrastructure, we think there are real opportunities there. You will have seen announcements where we want to link the North Island through to Auckland, down to Tauranga, that Golden Triangle, but many other parts of the country. We've had announcements in Wellington, and there'll be more to come. So this is announcements around public transport. It's announcements around roading infrastructure, but it is also looking at other forms of transportation so that we can have that modern mix. We need to make sure that when it comes to delivering on infrastructure, it is going to make a difference. The road for the sake of the road, if it's not to be used, won't do anything at all. But if we look at parts of New Zealand where
just keep hitting mute. No, I'm sure that's going to happen sometime. But it's
sorry. You've got
you've done where, or is it?
Sorry, you've done it again. You've got yourself on. You've got yourself on. You've turned yourself on. Sorry again.
Right. continue. So if you take the case in where I live in the Bay of Plenty, we invested in a road that would bypass Te Puke, and it's the Tauranga arterial route, and it goes sort of through the country. It links parts of Rotorua and the road from Whakatane and the kiwifruit areas into the port of Tauranga. And it was a significant investment. What we're now seeing in that area is announcements around economic development for business parks. In Rotorua itself, there are many businesses that have been looking to establish themselves there because we have a workforce that's available, we have land that's available, and it's so much closer to the port than it used to be. So in every case where we will make a decision when it comes to infrastructure is to ensure the economy can grow, it will deliver for everyday New Zealanders, and it will make us more economic, and it will give us opportunities at the same time to grow the economy. When it comes to reskilling and retraining, our workforce is very, very important. You know, with so many people losing their jobs, but putting aside COVID, it actually is something that we needed to continue to do already. I've got to say I've had great concern. I've been out around the country talking to people about the reforms we've seen to the tertiary sector and around our polytechs. And actually, I don't think the government has got it right. I think we've seen a case of ideology ahead of our best practice. We've said we want to unpick some of that to make sure that training and retraining and skills remains very much part of our regions. I just don't see how it works when it's run out in an office in Wellington, where actually, whilst there will always be improvements we should make to the system of tertiary education, actually uprooting it and moving it away from those that are closest to the workforce to Wellington is not going to work as well as we want it to, and it's not going to make sense. A greener and smarter future is about research and development. It's purely, I think, around research and development. And so what we need to do here is make sure that when it comes to the things that New Zealanders do very well, think about our agriculture and horticulture, that actually the new technologies that are being developed are made available not only here in New Zealand, so we have best practice, but it's part of the economy going forward as we put our best foot forward to the rest of the world. And then finally, building stronger communities. Well, it's very clear with a strong economy and lower levels of debt, you have stronger communities where people will be proud, they choose New Zealand as their home, and they continue to do so. A couple of final bits, and then we'll see what the timing is before we maybe stop, and there are a few questions. There are some things that we've said very clearly we want to do around rules and red tape and so on. Look, I actually feel for business and industry, large and small, but particularly small business. When it comes to regulation, I think a culture has developed in New Zealand where more regulation is a good thing. And anybody that's run a business or has had to look at a project, large and small, knows that that's not necessarily the case. Look, we need regulation and we need good frameworks, but we don't need more and more, because every time a new rule is put in place, there's a cost to that. And that cost to a business means that often there are fewer jobs that they can create. And we often hear a lot about local government, and I know we'll have councillors and others on board here listening today. I think actually successive governments have not paid enough attention when it comes to the burden we've placed upon local government when it comes to rules and regulations. And I think there's something we need to do there together to sit down and work out a better way to make sure that rules that are necessary and are important are responsible and they're easily complied with and don't just create a burden. Around the Resource Management Act, we have said we don't want to reform it, we want to get rid of it and start again, and have two pieces of legislation. One is equivalent of planning and the other is around the environment. So they can equally have a footing and compete with each other. Because I think when the RMA was first written, much of the balance was correct. But now it's often a tool that stops things from happening rather than allows and looks towards sustainability. And so again, many governments have looked to adapt and to change, but actually it's such a large piece of legislation that's had so many things bolted onto the side of it. It's time for us to go back to the drawing board, to keep the protection of the environment, to look towards sustainability, but to also look for ways that it's easier to work with in providing those protections. It allows business and industry to have certainty, to have fast decision making, and to allow our councils to do what I think many of them want to do, which is actually help economies to grow at the same time as to make sure that we have that balance when it comes to the environment. When it comes to, I mentioned regulation earlier, we've set a number of tasks here in our first 100 days in office, first 6 months in office. We want to get rid of 100 regulations. That's actually very easy to do because there are very many regulations that actually are not used anymore. But as we've started a process to go through and look at what those regulations should be, they're the significant ones that we believe will send a signal about the intention and the intent and how serious we are about saying more regulation itself is not good. And at the same time, we will set a standard in place that says for every new regulation that's created, 2 regulations must be taken away. And when that was proposed a while ago, I did say to our then leader that, you know, statistically that's not possible. We'll run out of regulations. But actually it's to help change the culture across government that says that when there is a problem, we should look at the regulation. If the regulation is fit for purpose and there was another reason that there was an issue, then we should consider that. If the regulation was at fault, then we should rewrite it as opposed to just adding to it. And I would argue that's the case when it comes to the RMA and the Building Act, but it's across many things that government does. The final thing I would say here, I suppose, is the reason that I think these things are important both today in a COVID and post-COVID world, but as we go forward, is what I said earlier about a national government, creating an environment where it's easier for business to operate. And if we can create an environment where it's easier for business to operate, many more businesses will survive, many more businesses will become profitable and will grow. So many more businesses will employ the New Zealanders that deserve a job that don't have one today through no fault of their own. And as that economy grows through a strong business community, then what we will find is the government has more choices, both in as far as taxation and lowering tax rates in the future are concerned, but also providing public service and reducing, getting on top and reducing the debt, the money that needs to be borrowed. At the crux of this is good infrastructure, because without good infrastructure in our cities and our regions, then it is very, very hard for this economy to grow, for those businesses to be productive. Finally, I would say that as we've probably just started the election campaign where you start to see policy, we will have a full suite of our economic development policy to be announced in the coming weeks before the election. I think you will like it. I've given you an indication, a hint of some of the areas that will go in, but there is more that we will announce and we will do there. How can we make the engine go faster? Well, it's got to be a partnership with local government, with business and industry, with environmental groups, but we've got to do so in such a way as opportunities provided for everyday New Zealanders. We want them to be able to come out of their homes to create businesses, to grow that economy and to work together. Thanks very much. Very happy to hear from you and to have any questions or comments as we go forward.
That's great. Thank you very much, Todd. And sorry about the interruptions. I imagine as a seasoned politician you're used to a few hecklers. So
it's very different. It's very different in Parliament. That was quite polite.
So, but we've been doing pretty well with the technology so far. So thanks very much. I think we're all getting used to working like this. A couple of questions sort of flown from that, and appreciate your final point about some of this is maybe part of your policies, which you're yet to release. But I'll ask them anyway, and you can either give us an indication where you can. So one of the first things is you obviously mentioned, well, you'll be clearly aware that the impact on our regions has been very different, mainly dependent on their industrial structure. We've had very different impacts across the country. And yesterday we heard from 3 or 4 leading sort of New Zealand economists who talked about those impacts, but also talked about the particularly important role of local government and the economic development agencies in working with government to respond to those differences, recognizing it wasn't a one-size-fits-all scenario, but also the importance of government thinking about how it invests in local government capability in order to do that. So I'd be quite interested in your perspectives on how you would be looking to both build on and work with local government in the future.
Yeah, well, look, I think over the 9 years we were in government, there were very good examples where it worked very well together from a regional economic development point of view. The first thing that that everybody needs, be it a business, be it an individual in their household, local government or central government, is certainty. And through certainty comes confidence to make the decisions we need to, to invest in the things that will help areas and regions grow. Under Stephen Joyce as Economic Development Minister, we went out to all of the regions and created partnerships through our regional economic growth agenda And there were quite substantial documents there that were negotiated and agreed that set out the framework and a plan to develop those regions. And from Northland, which was different from parts of the South Island, you know, the East Coast to my area of the Bay of Plenty, where there was an identification of the things that actually would help economies grow, and local government was a very important part of that. So what we sometimes think is it's, you know, it's local government versus central government, and in many cases I suppose it has been or it is, but the only way we get this right from a regional economic development point of view is if we're on the same page to the largest degree possible. Doesn't mean we'll agree everything, doesn't mean we should agree everything. There will always be some tensions. But if you think about, you know, we've seen the Provincial Growth Fund with Shane Jones, and I know you've got him later on in the week. And I've got to say, from a taxpayer point of view, I mean, it's right that there are so many people that are probably disappointed, or a lot more disappointed than they thought they were going to be. Because I don't see the plan other than let's spend money and grow an economy. And some of the spending decisions that have been made have felt like there's been more about the need to rush towards, you know, getting media coverage as we've moved towards election, than actually what is important to grow an economy and where the investments should be. And I've been very clear in my area, you know, put your hand up if the money is available, get it as fast as you can. But, you know, for Mr. Jones to be in the South Island and announce money for, you know, in one small town, a swimming pool and a library, doesn't feel like economic development to me. I'm very pleased for that small town to get it. I hope every small town in New Zealand has the same opportunity. So what we need is a concerted and obvious plan. And we need to work with local government and the business community and others about what that would look like. You know, we'll be having a look at what we had in place and dusting off again as part of our economic development proposals, should we have the responsibility to form a government. But when I talk about this around partnership, it's about lightening the load on local government from a regulatory point of view, helping everybody focus the mind on the things we need to do to get an economy growing, and having fewer meetings and fewer discussions. You know, the best way to build a road is to go out and build that road. And if we build the road, then the opportunity comes for all those that sit around it.
That's interesting. I think if we look back at those kind of regional growth studies, at the outset of the PGF, it was hoped that they would provide the framework for a number of the sort of investments that would potentially go into boosting those regional economies. And obviously some projects that have come through, or some projects that have emerged as shovel ready, can be traced back, but as you said, not necessarily all of them. And I do wonder if, you know, if you think about the last time when you came into power, National came into power in 2008, and you actually, you know, you lost some of the regional development funds, and then you went through and developed the growth strategies, etc. So would you see a similar process of being clear on those regional priorities, understanding what was really going to drive growth in those areas, and then looking at how you would invest in them?
Yeah. So when it comes to shovel ready, what's been most disappointing is we haven't really seen the list of what shovel ready is, nor the definition. And I won't go into detail because there are people who put in applications, got funding, and look, they get on with it. I don't want to single anybody out here, but it actually feels like it's just been a money scramble, a bit like the lolly scramble. Anything that you can say is shovel ready, we'll chuck some money at it. Now, I get from the point of view around creating jobs and investing in regions and so on, as a, you know, as a reaction to COVID. But if you don't have a plan, in the end, the money is not spent as well as it needs to. When we came to government, you know, the government's books were in a very bad state. Treasury was forecasting we would never be back to a surplus again, and we were borrowing. We had to be responsible and step back and not just continue to do the things that the Labor government had been doing. You know, some would argue we're a bit slow to get back to the plans of what we should do in the regions, but actually a lot happened during that period of time that had an impact upon the government's books. We're not in that situation now. We to a large degree know what the books are. We know we'll be borrowing. It comes back to what I said earlier. It is the responsibility of government at a time of economic downturn when they will be borrowing, and now borrowing more than ever before, to spend that money responsibly, and to spend it in such a way as every part of New Zealand, particularly in our regions, it will make a difference. And so, you know, in some cases, those regional growth studies that were done will still work very, very well. You're right that some of those projects continued under this government, and others have been picked up through shovel ready. But it'll also be necessary to go and have a look, because the world is not the same as what it was.
Changed. Yeah.
some of the priorities would have changed, and some of those councils have changed as well. It'll be my job, if I have the fortune to be the Economic Development Minister, to argue for the resources needed to make that work. But I want to send a very, very clear signal to the business community and the councils in our regions. It can't be a lolly scramble. It can't just be good money after good money, or bad money after good, or whatever the term is. Every single dollar is borrowed, and every single dollar must be paid back. And Judith Collins has been very, very clear. She's mindful of the burden that we will place on future generations if we are not cautious in what we spend. Final bit there is, you've heard Grant Robertson say we're going to slash $80 billion of public service and so on. Respectfully, I say that's absolute rubbish, and he would always say that. That's probably our playbook before as well. We will be investing more in public service every single year, but we will also be looking for things that aren't working as well and aren't responsible spending. A really good example of that is the money that was put into fees free. No extra students. Actually could have been targeted, could have been used a lot better, would have built a lot of roads, that would have created jobs for some of those students that are not studying.
Yeah, that's good. And so we also know the last couple of years there's been quite strong calls from local government New Zealand around sort of more fiscal devolution, and obviously recognising the degree of centrality, so more localism, more subsidiarity in those decisions around things like infrastructure investment being closer to the local level. Now, obviously, I think all of your points around, the money's got to be paid back, there's got to be clear lines of accountability. Is that part of the conversation that you would be seeking to have with sort of local government more generally, in terms of what's the role and responsibility of each tier in terms of that sort of fiscal decision making?
So I think the discussion about better local government is a very important one. I'm cautious around, every time we hear, devolution. And the reason for that is, devolution of service responsibility and so on. The reason for that is local government have been given a lot to do by governments, and some local government councils say that it's been dumped upon, and they find it very difficult to do, and it becomes a resource issue. I think actually there is a conversation to be had about better government and governance across the board, local government, central government, but I don't know that necessarily us decentralising and passing more responsibility to local government is a solution in itself. There will be areas where it probably does make sense, but there are also areas where I think in the end, as we've seen, previously, the model wouldn't work out as well as some would hope. So it's a conversation that's worth having. But when it comes to economic development, though, I think we can have a responsible and adult and robust conversation about what needs to be done and what doesn't have to be done. And very clearly, we've seen in the past, whether it be housing in Auckland, where local government is not able to or won't make the decisions that are needed, there is a wider consequence, not only for the citizens that live in that area, but the whole of that country. Government sometimes, share responsibility for that. We've got to find, create an environment, a culture where good decision making around economic development is done in a responsible and timely fashion. And I would be very interested to work with local government on finding ways to make that happen more.
Great. And one final question, as nothing else has come through, and change of tack slightly. You obviously talked about growth as well. And have you got anything coming forward in terms of what your industrial policy might be, in terms of where are the potential industries that could make New Zealand more successful and could provide the type of growth that you think will be required?
Yeah, absolutely. And so we have announced, I believe, or will announce in this area specifically, a minister with responsibility for industry and for manufacturing, and that policy will come out quite soon, so I won't dive into it quite deeply. But actually it's not going to be too different than many other things we are doing. We're talking more widely. I tell you, one of my big concerns at the moment, though, and this government hasn't paid enough attention to, and there could well be many reasons. It is about large industry in New Zealand, from Tiwai in the south to metal in Taranaki, to the Glenbrook steel mill, and refining up north. We're in serious risk of all of those changing or not being here at some stage in the near future. And some would argue, well, that's, be it as it may, that's okay, it's just part of our modern economy. Once they are gone, we will never get them back. And I think we need a conversation about what it means to have large industry here. It shouldn't be supported, it shouldn't be subsidised, it shouldn't be the taxpayer writing a cheque to keep them here. Although I know the 7,000 jobs down in Southland that directly and indirectly rely upon Tiwai would have a very different view of that. But actually, if you look at each of those, it comes to every decision that's been made by the government around industrial relations and health and safety and workplace and energy and the cost of energy has added cost and complication to their business, to the point where some of them will say it actually doesn't stack up or it's not worth it anymore, or we think it will get worse because we're not getting the signals that the government understands business and industry, and particularly large industry like that. Energy is a classic example of that. I think we need better policies in this area because we should not and we cannot lose those industries to New Zealand. Our economy, R&D and so on will be poorer for it. But when it comes to directly answering your question around manufacturing and so on, we have a specific policy in this area to be announced.
Brilliant. Todd, thank you very much for your time. Thanks very much for taking time to speak specifically with us about the economic development, which is obviously one part of a much bigger discussion that you're having with colleagues at the moment. It's been really useful to speak to you one-on-one. So thanks for the time.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a privilege.
Great. Thanks very much. So everybody, that brings us to the end of the program for today. Tomorrow we start again at 10 o'clock, and tomorrow's theme is what does recovery look like across New Zealand? And we'll be starting with Linda Stewart, the CEO of CEDA, talking about the Manawatu, which will obviously be an advert for our face-to-face conference next year. And after that, we'll have the opportunity to hear from the Honourable Phil Twyford. So carrying on the conversation that we've just had with the Honourable Todd McClay. I hope you've enjoyed today. Thank you very much for your input and questions, and I look forward to seeing you all again in the morning.